Individuals with microplastics in their blood vessels are 4.53 times more likely to suffer from heart attacks, strokes, or death within 3 years. A groundbreaking and mind-blowing study just came out, and it highlighted the alarming link between microplastics and vascular health. Among the 257 patients, 150 of them had detectable levels of polyethylene in their plaque. Dr. Twyman, I want to pop this over to you to get your big picture thoughts on this study and its findings.
It's a fascinating study that we're exposed to these things nonstop, but this is the first time that they've actually caught it in somebody's plaque. These patients were getting surgeries known as carotid endarterectomy. So they were taking severe plaques out of their arteries in the side of their neck. So these weren't people with just risk factors. They were already late to the game. And so then when they analyzed the plaque under special screening methods, they found these plastics in about 50% of the population. And the macrophages, which are part of the immune system, are gobbling this stuff up, and that was causing a lot of oxidative stress and inflammation inside these plaques. And then they followed these patients after their surgery, and as you said, there's a 4.5-fold increased risk of them having a heart attack, stroke, or dying over the next approximately 3 years from the index surgery. So it's fascinating that we're exposed to all these things, but what are we going to do about that? And that's really going to be the thing that we'll all have to kind of figure out, because the plastics are not going to go away, but maybe we could be drinking out of more glass. Maybe we can not have so many things stored in plastic, because we're not going to get it to zero, but we're going to talk about it today is like, what can you do to test your arteries? Like, how much are you actually being exposed to this? Is it affecting your arteries right now?
Before we move on to that topic, let's first just go back for a second. If we would just give people 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. When it comes to microplastics, we're not going to be able to remove them completely from our environment and our ingestion that's there. But what would be some of the top ways that we could protect ourselves? I know many experts on this podcast have come on and said, well, a lot of this is floating around in our water. So number one, either get a filter, preferably something like reverse osmosis, or your body becomes the filter. Do you agree with that? And is there anything else you would add in as we zoom in just specifically on microplastics?
So that's a good point that, we're probably going to have to filter more things. But it's my understanding is that they don't know exactly how these microplastics got into the plaque. They don't know if these were ingested or were they inhaled. Is it almost like a, smog type of situation where you're inhaling in the lungs and this is getting picked up? Likely it's probably from both sources. You won't be able to remove it all, but you can probably control the water that you drink. So it can be spring water out of glass bottles. You can do a reverse osmosis filter. That's going to get a lot of these total dissolved solvents out. But then we're also going to be mindful of the air we breathe, especially probably while you're sleeping. That 7.5, 8 hours is the most key time that your body's repairing. So probably having a nice HEPA filter in your bedroom might have the potential to help pull some of that out of the air that you'd be breathing.
That's great. So let's go back to the zooming out here and the bigger picture around this. Give our audience, you've been on the podcast before, but give our audience an understanding of how you think about vascular health.
So vascular health is fundamental to longevity. That's what I'm kind of talking about in the past year. There's a lot of great technologies that help you live longer. People want to talk about stem cells and hyperbaric oxygen, but the basics are the basics. If you don't take care of your vascular system, you're not going to get a chance at these advanced technologies. Are going to get you that extra 5-10 years at the end. Approximately every 40 seconds, somebody still has a heart attack in the United States. And there's over 800,000 heart attacks every single year. Many of them could be preventable with not necessarily completely simple lifestyle interventions, but they are preventable if you start early enough, looking at the endothelial health, looking at the glycocalyx. If you know that the person's at higher risk, you make the interventions, they don't go on to be one of those statistics.
So let's break down a few different things that you just mentioned over there. And this is all in the context of how to make yourself heart attack proof in the ideal world. And at least part of that is if you have had not the best lifestyle habits over the last however many years, how to also catch the presence of heart disease early so that you could do something about it. So let's break down a few words and sort of things that you mentioned. Endothelial health. What is it and what do you want people to know about it?
So for those that are listening, I'm showing a picture of an artery cut in cross section. And the blood flows in the lumen, and there's a lining of the artery called the endothelium, which is 1 cell thick. That endothelial lining, if you're able to strip it out of your arteries, is reportedly the surface area of 6 tennis courts. So it's actually your largest organ that you don't know about. But it's the endothelium, when it gets impaired or dysfunctional, that's the first sign that there's something wrong with your arteries. And if you don't do something about it, there's more potential that the arteries will ultimately become inflamed and then plaque will start to form. So the endothelium is critical to vascular health, and that's what we do here is do multiple tests to look at the health of your endothelium.
That's fantastic. We're recording here in your office, Apollo Cardiology, based in St. Louis. You've been kind enough to host me, my father, and also my brother-in-law, Dr. Neel Patel, who's also a cardiologist, has joined us as well too, and is here with us on the podcast. And what's been fascinating is to see that really we are in the midst of what I would call precision cardiology, precision medicine, functional medicine cardiology. We've had many functional medicine experts in different categories. There have not been as many that are out there in the world of cardiology. So we've sort of made the pilgrimage here, me and my family, to get the workup done, not only on ourselves, but to obviously educate our audience on all the advanced things that you guys get a chance to do. Now, I want to zoom out for 1 second here because you've mentioned a few different things. And before we continue on, and you have some great props for our audience here, some important things about cardiovascular disease that a lot of people don't know or sometimes forget. It is the number one killer in the world. In the four, henchmen of the apocalypse, cardiovascular disease is number one. In the United States alone, we have around 800,000 plus Americans have a heart attack, and roughly 200,000 of those are reoccurring heart attacks. And I think of the 800,000 of Americans that have a heart attack each year, I think it's upwards of 40% it's their first heart attack and they end up dying from it, right? I believe it's like somewhere around the stats. We'll fact check me afterwards and put the stats in the show notes. Globally, heart disease is the leading cause of death, as I mentioned, and there are over 17 million deaths annually each year. And something that a lot of women, my audience, mostly women that are listening, that they forget about is we often think of heart disease as something that somehow skews towards men, but it's actually the number one killer for women as well too. This is why this podcast is so important. The work that you're doing is so important. And the foundations that we're going to explain today is going to literally help save lives that are there. So I want to come back to you breaking down how you approach cardiology and how you think about cardiology in your practice and what you educate your patients about. When it comes to cardiology and people visiting their traditional cardiologist and wanting to avoid a heart attack, some of the standard advice that they get, of course, are the basics, which are very important. Neel, I might even have you chime in on some of those basics, right? Yeah. In terms of avoiding heart attacks. What are the standard things that you cover with your patients?
Yeah, so is your traditional lipid panel, so specifically your LDL, not looking at any other specialized lipid particles or anything like that, what is your LDL number? Where is it at? What's your blood pressure at? What's your A1C? Are you diabetic? Super important to differentiate between diabetes and prediabetes, but the conversation around glucose. So the basics is lipid panel, blood pressure check, A1C, and then weight.
Right.
How much exercise do you do? Can you tolerate a certain load of exercise? Can your heart accommodate that type of functional movement? And do you have any symptoms? It's a very cursory way of looking at it, but it captures, a good general audience. But yeah, that's the general approach on cardiovascular health, and people even coming to us in our clinic saying, hey, I'm able to do X, Y, and Z, so I guess I must be okay. Right? My LDL said it was okay based on my history. Okay, so I guess it's okay because I'm 34 and my LDL is 100. Not a big deal. So I think there's deeper conversations that need to be had, but that's generally the approach or the conversation that happens.
Michael, take us from there. Obviously, you've been trained as a traditional cardiologist, but now in your practice, build and expand on those. I think you would agree with largely most of those things that are brought up, but why are they not the complete story and picture in terms of the latest advancements that we have with cardiology?
And those were an excellent review of the top 5 risk factors for vascular disease. So high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, diabetes, smoking, and obesity. They're very important, but there's a couple hundred other risk factors that could potentially damage your arteries and set you up for this. I'm sure we'll talk about ApoB and all the fancy lab stuff that we can do later, but it really comes down to what is the health of the arteries. And that's something that I did not necessarily get in my conventional training. I was an invasive cardiologist for many years, taking care of people in the middle of the night having heart attacks. It's very rewarding, but you sort of thought this person was already on a statin, they're already on an aspirin, they're already on a beta blocker and ACE inhibitor, the standard of care. They just had their second heart attack. What did we miss? And I was just getting curious. Okay, what is the missing link? A lot of times it's inflammation, or now that I know it's more low levels of nitric oxide is a big role. And so I just got curious and would go to different conferences and kept finding new ways to think about vascular health. It's not that the conventional system is necessarily wrong. They're just set up more to kind of take care of it when it's near the end game. Like most people, honestly, are not going to a cardiologist for screening. They're usually doing this with a primary care doctor, or if it's a woman, sometimes an OBGYN. Because most time you see a cardiologist when you're having chest pain, shortness of breath, palpitations, or maybe you have a very strong family history and you want to go like, hey, I don't want to end up like dad. And the general cardiologist will say like, okay, well, let's do a stress test, an EKG, and maybe they'll do an echo to look at the heart function. And they'll say, yeah, that looks generally low risk. But they didn't directly look at your arteries. They were looking at kind of downstream effects. And I wanted to kind of focus more on like, let's look at the arteries directly, because just having high cholesterol is not necessarily a guarantee you're going to have plaque, but having normal cholesterol, the converse, is the same. Half the time people have heart attacks, they have, quote, normal cholesterol. So it's part of the equation, but it's not the whole equation.
So you were talking about the health of the blood vessels, right? What are some of the other things you explain to your patients and that you want to explain with our audience here on the podcast today about what other things make up healthy blood vessels in the body?
So we talked a little bit earlier about the endothelium, and that's been known about for many years. But in the 1960s, they actually discovered something called the endothelial glycocalyx. That's a protective gel coating that lines the endothelium. And so think about taking a fish out of water and it's slimy. That's the glycocalyx of the fish. Your arteries have that type of lining. It's a protective coating. If that coating is healthy, then the things that flow through the blood tend not to stick to the artery lining, like Velcro. I got a picture in front of me that has Velcro on it. So if you have a damaged glycocalyx, then it's much more likely that the lipoproteins full of cholesterol and triglycerides are going to stick to the artery like Velcro, or that the white blood cells or the platelets that are floating through the blood stick there. The glycocalyx is a shield. It prevents certain things from sticking to the arteries. There's different antioxidants in it to prevent the arteries from basically rusting from the inside out. There's different coagulation molecules in there so that if you get a cut, the body can instantly respond. And then there's different things that help with the immune response. But it's one of those things where it's like, if the glycocalyx goes down and you don't do something to repair it, you're set up to go down this pathway where inflammation and plaque will form in your arteries. And so I think sometimes, cardiology and primary care, they get too lipid-centric. And the lipids are important, but it's downstream. It's 4 or 5 steps downstream from when the glycocalyx and the endothelium are getting impaired.
Let's talk about the glycocalyx. What are the things that damage it the most, that everybody should be paying attention to and should know about in this conversation of catching it away sort of pre-heart disease?
The glycocalyx is fragile, but it is easy to repair if you get out of its own way. So again, think of it like a protective gel coating. The big things that damage it are going to be smoking, which nobody should be doing these days. Even vaping is a problem. There's heavy metals and other things that are going to be inhaled that could damage the glycocalyx. High insulin and glucose. There's approximately like 80% of Americans are not necessarily metabolically that healthy. So just having high insulin glucose is enough to damage this protective gel coat, which is a lot of its carbohydrates and polysaccharides. We talked about the microplastics. That's likely the mechanism of action. It's damaging the glycocalyx. Air pollution, oxidized lipids, heavy metals, COVID. The spike proteins had a predilection to damaging that coating. So many things can damage it. You just have to figure out what's damaging it and try to remove those things. Unfortunately, we have ways to kind of test how healthy the arteries are. And then there are products, supplements, and sometimes medications that can help regenerate the glycocalyx if it's been injured.
One of the things that you didn't directly say, but is part of your answer is, in a way, ultra-processed foods. Where do those fit in, and where does diet fit into the glycalyx?
The glycocalyx is heavily hydrated. It's like a carbohydrate shield. If you're eating high fructose corn syrup, if you're eating trans fats, you're eating things that are going to cause a lot of oxidative stress and inflammation, the glycocalyx is going to get damaged from that process. I'm sure we'll talk more deeply about food, but my idea is that photosynthesis has to touch your food web. Food that's made in a factory is not really food. And so sunlight is growing your food and you go eat that food and your mitochondria then break that down, or you eat the animal that ate that plant and then you reverse that process. Whatever you're putting into your body, your glycocalyx is going to sense that. And so if it's fried fats, if it's tons of high fructose corn syrup, your glycocalyx is going to likely get damaged from that process.
And how does the damage actually take place? If we were able to look inside, is there an analogy or an idea? Is it rubbing up against it, and now all of a sudden that glycocalyx is exposed and everything underneath it is exposed? Like, what's actually happening inside the body?
So, think of like, if I have a little artery here I'm showing in cross section, think of like a garden hose that's, a circle and you're slicing it. Well, the blood's floating in the middle, but the glycocalyx extends out into the lumen where the blood is flowing. And it's basically an invisible gel coat. But if you actually use an electron microscope, it's going to look more like grass at the bottom of a riverbed. And it's just sensing the flow of the things floating by it. But there's little things that live in the grass, It's kind of like the reeds in like a marsh, like the crabs, the shrimp, they're all living in there. Well, there's different clotting factors and there's different antioxidants like superoxide dismutase, and just sensing what's floating through the blood. But if you have high blood pressure or high sugar, it's going to basically do a haircut, knock those glycocalyx tendrils off, and then what's floating through the blood basically starts sticking there, kind of like a pothole. And then your body can repair it and you go back to normal. But if you don't repair it, then these things continue to kind of go further and further down into the sediment. So you can breach the endothelium. Then you get into intimal space, and the intima starts to swell. And then the white blood cells start coming in, and they start gobbling up what's coming into the intima. And then that cascade will lead ultimately to plaque formation. So it's really something where you think of it as kind of like seagrass, and whatever damages the seagrass is the problem. Try to withdraw that, and then the arteries can generally start trying to heal themselves.
So if you wouldn't mind, just a quick recap of some of the top things in sort of a listicle order that you want people to know that damages this very delicate coating inside of the body, which is a big part of how you see heart disease starting in its earliest stages.
So the glycocalyx is damaged by many things. Aging, which you can't necessarily control, but high insulin, high glucose, high oxidized LDL. Not all LDLs are necessarily problematic. It's the ones that have been modified. We just talked about microplastics at the top of the hour, heavy metals, air pollution. Those are probably the top things that are going to be damaging the glycocalyx.
We talked about what damages the glycocalyx. Let's talk a little bit about what actually helps us protect it, what strengthens it. And this really gets into sort of your approach to your interventions that you recommend on the lifestyle side for people strengthening their blood vessels and their mitochondria. So what supports this coating inside of the body and leads to healthier blood vessels?
Always start with trying to withdraw the things that are doing the damage. And so, taking a thorough history, like, hey, the person's smoking, get them to stop smoking. They do no exercise, get them to do exercise. They don't eat green leafy vegetables, get them to do that, because there's precursors in those green leafy vegetables that ultimately might become nitric oxide. If they're using antiseptic mouthwash that disrupts the oral microbiome, get them off that. So a lot of times it's trying to withdraw the things that they just didn't understand would be impacting their arteries. And then since a lot of it's metabolic, it's affecting glucose and insulin levels, whatever lifestyle intervention you want to try to do to improve their insulin sensitivity. So our mutual friend, Dr. Lyon, this is muscle-centric medicine. 80% of your glucose is destined to go to your skeletal muscle. So what do you got to do to do that? Well, you got to get this person doing more resistance training. You got them eat high quality protein so that they can lay down more muscle units to be able to burn that glucose. So doing anything you can to get them to be more metabolically healthy is key. And then you can do the other advanced testing that looks at things such as high homocysteine, high uric acid, high oxidized LDL. And then there's different supplements and medications that can be used to dial those things back as well. And then if that's still not working, there are different glycocalyx promoters, different supplements that basically give that protective gel coating building blocks to try to lay down a better gel coat. And there's different antioxidants to try to prevent that gel coat from rusting in the first place. So there's a couple of commercially available supplements that have been shown to help improve the glycocalyx.
In the last few years, there's been an explosion of research and awareness about metabolic health, which is also in those 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Number 1 is heart disease. Number 2 is cancer. Number 3 is metabolism disorders. And then number 4 is Alzheimer's and dementia, neurological issues that are there. There's been an explosion in focus on metabolic health. If you just look around at the population, you wouldn't think so necessarily, but it's a little bit of a delayed thing. There's more and more physicians that are out there that are talking about the importance of metabolic health at the earliest stages. There's more people that have ever been talking about pre-diabetes and having higher than average blood sugar and how we need to start paying attention to this. There's been more people that have been looking at continuous glucose monitors and companies like Levels and other places that are out there. Neel, being in this sort of quote unquote traditional system, even though Kaiser does a great job to be a little bit ahead of the curve. What are some of the things that you talk to your patients about when it comes to metabolic health and how important it is for them?
The way I kind of tell them is probably similar to what Dr. Twyman was saying, is it's really just about how do you build your body's resilience to all the things that it is exposed to. Externally, there's a lot of things with microplastics, we talk about water filters. Internally, which is the metabolic health, is what are you doing regularly to kind of help promote the health and the resilience of your cells. So I usually tell people cardiovascular health, so getting some degree of cardio in a week, and then resistance training to help kind of build up those muscle reserves to kind of handle the glucose load, to handle things such as frailty, and to help you kind of just move through life a little bit better. A lot of the times, those exercise or those interventions can actually help with prediabetes, diabetes control. It can also help you increase nitric oxide synthase, which helps you increase your nitric oxide, which can over in the long term only contribute to a lower blood pressure, contribute to better metabolic flexibility is what I call it. So I'll generally tell people is you want to schedule this like you schedule anything else in your day. You want to schedule your exercise time, you want to schedule your sleep time. You want to make those priorities just to make it a lot more fluid. And the key to all of this is just sustainability. How long can you do this? And picking at the different levers that you know you want to get involved with, because that will keep you consistent, that'll keep you happy, that'll keep you wanting to keep coming back for more.
You know, both of you talked a little bit about nitric oxide, and we really haven't gone into just how important of a role it plays on everything that we're talking about today. So Michael, I want to pass it over to you, right? You are one of the biggest champions of why nitric oxide is so important and why it's so problematic that its production lowers, especially as we age, especially if we're living like most people do in the world. So what is nitric oxide and how does it play a crucial part in cardiovascular health?
So nitric oxide is a gas. It's very short-lived, but in the vascular system, it's a vasodilator. And while I learned about it in my traditional training, I didn't understand how mission critical it actually was. When we have patients come into the hospital with chest pain, we're also giving them nitroglycerin. We're just flooding them with an agent that's going to give them a ton of nitric oxide to dilate their blood vessels. But nitric oxide, normally, it's produced right on the lining of the arteries. So if the glycocalyx is healthy, then the underlying endothelium is going to be able to release nitric oxide. So in the presence of oxygen and arginine, there's an enzyme called endothelial nitric oxide synthase. That enzyme will then convert it to citrulline, and nitric oxide gets kicked off. The nitric oxide gas then diffuses into the muscle, into the artery, and then that causes the muscle and artery to relax. That keeps the flow normal in your artery. And nitric oxide also somewhat repels the lipoproteins in the white blood cells from sticking to the artery in the first place. So you have healthy nitric oxide levels, you should have healthy arteries. But after the age of 40, that endothelial nitric oxide synthase enzyme tends to slow down. It's just not as functioning as it was when you're 20 years old. So Mother Nature built in a backup pathway, this intersalivary pathway. When you eat your green leafy vegetables and your beets that have high nitrates in it, if you have the right nitrate reducing bacteria in your saliva, it will convert that to nitrites. Those nitrites that get swallowed go into your stomach. If you have stomach acid, there will ultimately be a process where nitric oxide gets produced. So if you use a lot of antiseptic mouthwash, or if you use acid blocking medicines, you're going to disrupt that backup pathway. And so it's sort of kind of like a 2 strikes, you're out. If one pathway is working, you probably still have enough nitric oxide that your arteries are going to dilate and your blood pressure will be normal. But if that salivary pathway never worked or you broke it, and you're now 70 years old and your endothelial nitric oxide synthase enzyme doesn't work very well to begin with, then that's when you start seeing these stiffer arteries and higher blood pressure. And if it's long enough, likely they're going to have more and more plaque in their artery. So nitric oxide is often the canary in the coal mine, is that there's a lot of tests that we did today that showed us like how healthy your levels are right now. But the signs and symptoms, if you don't have this type of testing, is you could just have fatigue, you could have brain fog, you can have erectile dysfunction. I probably said it many times, but ED equals ED. If you don't have enough nitric oxide in the penis tissues, you won't maintain erections. That's the big canary in the coal mine, that there's something wrong with your vascular system. Oftentimes, patients take the little blue pills. It's not that that's the problem. It's that you don't have enough nitric oxide going into the system. We have to figure out why you don't have that and try to replete that as possible.
Just a reminder of some of those things that you mentioned, the healthy lifestyle habits that people have that lead to high levels, especially as we age, of nitric oxide. If you could give a little bit of a recap on that.
The biggest one is probably going to be exercise. As you're exercising, you're forcing blood across the endothelial glycocalyx, and then the underlying endothelium will release nitric oxide. So exercise is one of the best anti-aging drugs partly because it's releasing nitric oxide. The second one is going to be sunlight. It's the UVA spectrum of sunlight. When it strikes your skin, that nitric oxide is going to get liberated from the blood vessels. And then dietary-wise, it's mostly the green leafy vegetables, the spinach, the arugulas, the kales, and beets. Those just have high dietary nitrates. And then if you have the right situation where you have the right bacteria in your saliva and you have stomach acid, more nitric oxide will get produced.
So I want to talk about sunlight just for a quick second, because there's so many different misconceptions about it. You're talking about wanting to have us increase our exposure to the sun to support the production of nitric oxide. Talk to us about why that's important and how that actually happens, and why do so many people have this idea that we generally want to be avoiding the sun outside of vitamin D production.
And that's the challenge, is that people think the sun is all about tans or vitamin D production. And it's so much more. I tie back into the photosynthesis. We would not have any of these plants and foods to eat if we did not have sunlight. So to think that the sun is all bad is definitely misguided. But it is a tool. You do not want to burn. You do not want to be fried. You don't want to cause all this oxidative stress and inflammation to your tissue. So if you've avoided the sun for years, it is not the right answer to go out at noon and start baking. Your skin needs to build up a solar callus over time. So I always lead it back to what would an optimal day be? If you're up before sunrise, you want to keep your light very dim because you don't want to basically disrupt your circadian biology. The first bright light that enters your eyes should be sunlight outside. You get that light into your eyes and it sets the body's supracosmic nucleus, which is the master clock in the brain to tell the rest of the organs, hey, it's daytime. So cortisol, your sex hormones, will start to rise. But in the morning time, there's no UV light. Your skin is not going to burn. But somewhere between half an hour to an hour after the sun rises, the spectrum of UVA light will get through the atmosphere. Typically, when your skin starts feeling warm, that's when UVA is getting through the atmosphere. And then depending on how high you're off of the equator will determine when UVB is going to be available. And when UVB strikes your skin, then that's what's going to sulfate the cholesterol and ultimately become vitamin D. And so there's free apps out there that will tell you, where the sun rises at your local location, when is the UVA window open, when is the UVB window open. And here in St. Louis, there's 2 months out of the year where the UVB window is completely closed. The sun never rises high enough in the atmosphere to make vitamin D for 2 months in St. Louis. So you have to know what are the proper times to go outside for these different wavelengths. But from the nitric oxide standpoint, it's really when that UVA spectrum's out. So it's going to be half hour to an hour from when the sun rises to about that half hour to hour before the sun sets is the main window. Do you need to be out there the entire time? Absolutely not. You have to kind of build up that solar callus. But if you have high blood pressure and you're not getting proper light exposure, well, the light basically is acting as a natural calcium channel blocker. You can lower your blood pressure if you're getting proper light signals.
So one of the most famous protocols that's out right now is like the Huberman protocol, where people go out and they get that morning sunlight and that evening sunlight, primarily for the regulation of our circadian rhythm, and then also to support more energy in the morning and also deep, restful sleep at night. And I can't remember exactly, we could probably pull it up and put it on the screen here, but I think he generally recommends, 5 to 10 minutes first thing in the morning when the sun comes. A lot of people like to sit outside and drink their coffee and just enjoy and get a little bit of sun exposure. And another really cool thing is, you can use, if you have an iPhone or the weather app, you can see that the UV spectrum doesn't really start to really pull up in that first hour of the day. So people who are really afraid about sort of aging their skin, it's not going to be at the place super early in the morning and super late at night where that's really going to be taking place. Is that accurate? I've talked to countless experts, skincare specialists, and even plastic surgeons who all tell me that red light therapy is one of the best therapies we can use on our skin. And my favorite red light device is Lumevox. I love Lumevox because number one, it's portable and simple to use. Number two, it's FDA registered. And number three, best of all, it's affordable. Personally, red light therapy has helped me improve the appearance of my skin. It's also helped me with muscle and pain recovery. And red light therapy has also been shown to improve multiple studies on inflammation, wound healing, hair, and it's even been shown to stimulate our mitochondria. I use this device every single night before bed, and it's the perfect way to wind down. I swear it's helped me sleep better. Right now, Lumevox is offering my community $260 off their portable red light device. Just go to thelumebox.com/Dhru to get your device. I know you're going to love it.
That's accurate, and it's mostly the lack of burning. You do not want to burn because that is what's going to cause the DNA damage and the rapid photoaging. But it's the unbalanced light that tends to cause some of that photoaging. So you get a lot of melasma of your skin if you're just in front of these devices all day long, soaking in 5,500 Kelvin blue light from your devices. It's the red spectrum of light that balances that out. The red light is anti-inflammatory. The red light stimulates collagen production and prevents wrinkles. So the balance of the light tends to prevent that. That being said, you're right. If people are more sensitive to light, that morning light is preconditioning your skin. If you get into that habit, 5-10 minutes a day, more is fine. If you're sicker, you're probably going to need more. But if you're generally healthy, it's instantaneous. That effect as light hits that melanopsin receptor in the eye. You set the clock, but it is a peaceful time in the morning. You can also stack your hacks. You can be grounding outside. You can do other things while you're out there. Think of it as like a sun break throughout the day. Your body's always trying to crave what time of day is it, and you're giving it those signals, those Zeitgeibers. The light that enters your eyes and the timing your nutrients come in are the two biggest ones. And so the body wants to figure out that there's a light cycle and a dark cycle. And so once the sun sets, no more blue light's supposed to hit your melanopsin receptors. Your body gets a big signal. Oh, it's nighttime. And 3 to 4 hours later, you should be going to sleep. Your cortisol levels are dropping, your melatonin levels start to rise. And melatonin is the hormone of darkness that helps you stay asleep. But melatonin is also critically important as an antioxidant. It's essentially the fuel that repairs the mitochondria that have been potentially getting damaged during the daytime. And you're making all these different hormones based off the light signals that hit your eyes and hit your skin, but they get released during different times of darkness.
So going back to what I was sharing about the Huberman protocol, and we'll fact check it afterwards, but I think it's like 5 to 10 minutes in the morning. He's trying to give the minimum effective dose for what he's talking about. What is your recommendation when it comes to this category? And, I learned this phrase from you, and you talked about it on the podcast last time, photobiomodulation. Right? That's the practice of getting this sort of red light and other light spectrums, but in particular, we're talking about red light in a way that's therapeutic for your body. So what are you recommending to individuals? And I know it depends on sort of where they're at, but as a base level, what's your recommendation?
So always want to use natural sunlight because it's always going to have the right wavelengths of light. And so if you're somebody who's very, pasty white and you burn easily, start very slow and build yourself up. But that morning light will get that skin conditioned for later when UV comes out. So if you do this for a few weeks to months, you're much less likely to burn high noon in July, wherever you're at. But back to your question about photobiomodulation, I often joke that it's a supplement. It's not supposed to replace the sun. You use it when you don't have access to the sun, or you have an acute injury and you're just trying to get more photons of light into that injury. So in my office here, I have multiple of these different red light panels. The best way to think about these panels is that the light is absorbed into the mitochondria and 3 big things happen. It's going to release nitric oxide from the mitochondria, and that's going to help dilate blood vessels. It's going to decrease reactive oxygen species, free radicals. You're not going to rust as much when this light therapy is being applied. And the third big thing is it's going to produce more ATP in the mitochondria, more energy. Then your body takes that energy and does what it does. Your brain works better, your heart works better, your musculoskeletal system works better with more energy. So photobiomodulation, multiple use cases from head to toe, but it's mostly to charge up your mitochondria, and then they know what to do with that energy.
So we got on this topic of light therapy, photobiomodulation, because we're talking about nitric oxide, and to recap there was a few things you mentioned. Exercise, what is your dosage that you talk about with patients, from your end, Michael, and then we'll go over to Neel. What's your recommendation?
It always depends, where's the person starting from? If they're basically just coming off the couch, try to get them to doing resistance trainings twice a week, and then trying to get a couple sessions of zone 2 type training initially. And zone 2 is the low and slow cardio where you're just trying to build mitochondrial efficiency at being able to burn fat for energy. And then once you've got enough of a base of the zone 2, then you can start teaching them how to do some of the interval type training. But if somebody's more fit, then it's really what are their goals? If it's really longevity, well, there is a minimal effective dose. You probably want at least 150 minutes of moderate activity a week, and that resistance component 2 to 3 times a week. That's the minimal effective dose. But I've also worked with people who are professional bodybuilders and athletes. That's a different skill set. I think of that more as a skill versus a health promoting activity, because a lot of the times the challenges those guys face is that they're overdoing it. They're overtaxing their nervous system. they're short sleeping themselves, and they don't have the ability to recover from all oxidative stress and inflammation that they put on their system. So they can be very, very fit looking on the outside, but they've thrashed their vessels. There's just been so much endothelial dysfunction because of the lack of recovery component to it. So that's why often I tell people, like, show me, I'm from Missouri, you got to show me that your arteries are healthy. And so exercise is the greatest drug, but it is a proper dose effect.
Yeah, and generally for the vast majority of people who are listening, they're not going to be overdoing it. They're probably underdoing it a little bit. That's really a conversation for like professional athletes in some sort of context, and maybe even sometimes like people who are regular marathon runners. I've heard this from a lot of individuals. In fact, David Perlmutter was on the podcast last week, and he had been struggling for a few years with some sleep issues and other things that were there, and he went in to get diagnosed, and I think he was at the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic, and they found out that he had AFib. And then his doctor had asked him, let me guess, you're a long distance runner. And they said that a huge percentage of his patients that have AFib, I don't know if either of you have seen this, are individuals who are overdoing the sort of long distance running, the marathon running. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, you mean to chime in? Yeah. So you get an adaptation with exercise where you can see in young patients, their ventricle, which is the pumping chamber of their heart, gets a little bit thicker. So that by itself is not abnormal. If you have really uncontrolled high blood pressure, then the thickness can become abnormal and that can lead to other issues. But the top chamber, the atrium, that's where the atrial fibrillation starts, and that's where the terminology is. That can actually stretch in accommodation to all that extra blood volume that you're getting as an athlete. So we see this a lot in football players where they will come in AFib, but it's because of that long adaptation where the top chamber of the heart stretches out, and that predisposes people to having an irregular heart rhythm or atrial fibrillation in this case. And it could just be, again, like anything else, or diabetes or LDL or high blood pressure, how long were you exposed to that? Well, we'll call it an insult, even though it's not necessarily a negative connotation. How long were you exposed to it, and under what conditions? Anything else there?
No, very much so. And I have the little heart somewhere I'll show you guys.
All right, so those of you that are listening, Michael just pulled out a heart model that he's going to walk us through, and you'll describe what we're talking about.
Correct. This is not life size. This would be more like probably a cow. Like the human heart's about the size of your fist. But as he was mentioning, like the atria are the top chambers, the ventricles are the bottom chambers. But in patients who are high-level athletes, they're going to increase their stroke volume and improve their cardiac output by stretching out their atria and sometimes even stretching out the left ventricle. So that they're just pumping this blood around this circuit so much faster to deliver all these oxygen nutrients to their muscles. But this top chamber is much thinner than the bottom chamber. The bottom chamber is relatively thick, but the top chamber, it's kind of like a balloon. The more it gets stretched out, the more it may not actually shrink back down. And so there's different echo criteria to tell you, like, do you have mild, moderate, or severe left atrial enlargement? It's one of those cases where the larger the atria are, the more likely they're to have more of this atrial fibrillation. And it's, something I learned from some of my attendings was that, like, AFib begets AFib. So the longer you're in AFib, you start basically burning in different pathways in the atria that you're just more likely to keep going in and out of this. And people who tend to be younger, they tend to be much more sensitive to going into atrial fibrillation. We definitely had older patients who have no idea that they're in it. Partly they're just not that active. But if somebody's very active, the loss of their atrial kick can be a big problem for them. So about 20% of your stroke volume comes from the atria. So there's a valve, the mitral valve, between the top chamber of the left atrium and the bottom chamber of the left ventricle. So as the blood comes back from your lungs, it's just passively flowing through this atria into this mitral valve into the ventricle. But then the atria contracts and squeezes about 20% more of the blood through the valve closes, and then your left ventricle pumps and sends it out through air duct to your brain and the rest of your body. But in atrial fibrillation, instead of a coordinated pump, that atria is quivering like a bag of worms, and so it's not going to be pushing that extra 20% down into the left ventricle. Well, at rest, that's probably not a problem for most people. But if you're a high-level athlete trying to sprint, 18 miles an hour, and you lose 20% of that, you're just not going to be able to go anymore. And so that's why they're so symptomatic when they get that loss of that atrial kick.
So again, zooming out, we were talking about exercise because of its role with nitric oxide, and nitric oxide with its role with a healthy vascular system in general. And is it fair to say, just so everybody really connects the dots, because we're not dealing with probably a lot of professional athletes on this podcast or marathon runners, a few of you out there, shout out to you. If people don't use it and actually exercise on a regular basis, they're gonna have low levels of nitric oxide most likely, right? If they're not regularly active in the blue zones that are out there, they're not exercising necessarily, but they're active all day long. They're squatting, they're getting up and down, they're gardening, they're doing things, they're getting a ton of steps in. And so as we age, the less active we are, that's going to make us more at risk for cardiovascular disease.
Absolutely.
So I want to jump out to another topic that you mentioned with nitric oxide, which was making sure that we get our nitrates inside of our diet, right? What do you generally recommend for people who are listening and when it comes to getting the minimum that's needed to make sure they support their nitric oxide?
And this gets where it's a little bit challenging, is that it's going to depend on where they're getting their foods from. And the part that isn't as fun to know about is that organically grown food is going to have 10 times less nitrates than conventionally grown because of the soil conditions. So you almost can't eat enough organic greens to actually get a load of nitrates through your diet. And then, so in those people, if they start having a lot of issues, they're probably going to end up on a concentrated beetroot supplement that actually has that amount of nitrates in it, or they can take various other supplements to promote nitric oxide if they don't want to do the juices. But you always want to try, because even if you can't get all the nitrates through the vegetables, there's other polyphenols and other things you want to get from the vegetables, but you may not be able to get all your nitrates from your diet.
Okay, great. So we have exercise. We have making sure that we have our beets and our dark leafy greens. If not, potential supplementation. We'll get into a whole category on supplements, but just so we don't leave people hanging, is there a favorite that you like when it comes to some of these beet supplements or nitric oxide support supplements?
The Beet Elite has been studied a lot. It comes in like these little plastic bottles, unfortunately. But maybe the nitric oxide could, block some of the microplastics. I'm not sure. But Beet Elite has a concentrated dose of either 300 to 400 milligrams of nitrates. It doesn't taste that bad. I have some in the fridge for patients to try if they're interested. And then if people really don't want to drink it, there are other concentrated either lozenges or capsules that can kind of help promote nitric oxide production then.
Great. We'll chat about some of those. So we have making sure we get our nitrates. We have making sure that we have exercise. And we also talk about making sure that we have proper exposure to the sun. And then if you're not, supplementing with things like red light therapy can be components that could be helpful. Are there ways to measure nitric oxide? And talk about some of the things you had, me, Neel, and my dad, Kumar, who's here with us today. Talk about some of the things you had us to do to see how healthy is our nitric oxide production.
So that's what we're all set up here to do at Apollo Cardiology, is look for vascular disease at the earliest stages. Now, there's not really any commercially available testing to be able to directly test the endothelial glycocalyx. There's some microscopes that are in development, but there's nothing that can directly look at how healthy the glycocalyx is. So you have to kind of look at what is the layer below that? Because if the endothelium is not working well, then you already assume that the top layer is not working either. So we did some testing that looked at your nitric oxide levels that you can produce through your saliva. So there's a test strip. You put the test strip in your mouth, get the test strip wet, then you kind of close the little plastic strip, and it's kind of like litmus paper. It's going to change the color. And the brighter red it is, the more nitrates that you're getting through your diet. Is the first part of the test. And the second part is, do you likely have the right nitrate reducing bacteria in your saliva? Because there's certain people that just lack that bacteria, or they're using antiseptic mouthwashes and destroying those bacteria. And so they can eat all the beets and the greens they want in the world, but it's the bacteria in their saliva that breaks those nitrates down. So we did those tests on you today. You were a little bit low on that part, but the later tests showed that you make plenty of nitric oxide. So it all has to kind of rhyme. We just know that, okay, we're going to have to do some blood work to figure out, is there high uric acid or homocysteine or something else that's sort of breaking that pathway. Then we did tests to look directly at the arteries themselves. So we had a device that does pulse wave velocity. It clips to your finger, and it gives us your heart rate, but it's also looking at the elasticity of the arteries. So the blood leaves your heart, goes in those arteries, and if your arteries are healthy, they're going to expand and they're going to contract. And it's going to be kind of like an accordion snapping back and forth. They're not going to be like a little lead pipe. And this test takes 1 minute, not painful, and it gives you a score between 1 and 7. The lower the score, the better. So you are a type 2 today. Most were type 2, but half of them are almost type 1. So you're almost completely excellent on that test. So very good pulse wave velocity. So that tends to mean that the arteries probably can release nitric oxide efficiently if they can stay very elastic. So that's a quick and easy test that we do on every patient that walks in here. There's no real special prep you need to do for that part of the test.
But can I add in one more item before we continue? Neel scored a type 1, I believe.
He did.
What is he doing right that I'm not doing? I need to aspire to his level. What do you think are some of the things that he's doing that I could be incorporating?
We'll have to actually see what the blood work shows, because I don't think it's actually going to be a major lifestyle thing. I think it's going to be removing something that's in your blood work that has the effect. I think you probably have more lipid issues than he does, and that might be the differentiator. And
He does also work out pretty much every morning. So I know there's a higher degree of probably cardiovascular fitness that's there. He also goes rucking on the weekends as well too. Neil's been a big inspiration to our family when it comes to all things fitness. So I need to start incorporating some of those things inside of that.
And he beat you by like that much. So it wasn't like a big deal.
But he also outscored me, you might be getting to this in a second, on the endopat test.
He did beat you a little bit on the endopat test.
Can you talk about that test, and does that help you at all in understanding how much nitric oxide production is going on, or if the blood vessels are healthy?
So the endopat test is a non-invasive test. A lot of calibration work was done at the Mayo Clinic, which is one of the world's expert cardiology facilities. And I first learned about this device back probably in 2013, 2014 from Drs. Mark Houston and Dr. Nathan Bryan, who did a lot of the research with this type of device and some of the early nitric oxide lozenges. But the way that this device works is that the person has to come in fasting, no caffeine, because you don't want anything that's vasoactive that would constrict their arteries. There's a 5-minute warm-up period with the test. So you have probes on your finger that's measuring the flow in each fingertip. It looks like a little seismograph as the flow is going through the finger. So there's a 5-minute warm period, make sure all the devices are working well. And then there's the test part. So you have a blood pressure cuff on your brachial artery. We pump up that blood pressure cuff higher than your systolic blood pressure, and you do not have high blood pressure by far. And so that temporarily seeds the flow to the arm. And so that probe then doesn't sense any more blood flow, and the line just goes flat. The other arm acts as the control, and you keep seeing it going up and down like a little seismograph or a metronome. After 5 minutes, we then release the stopcock in the blood pressure cuff, and the blood's going to rush back down into your arm. And that's basically the stress test for the arteries. That blood flow comes rushing back down into your arm. It's going to flow over the endothelial glycocalyx. The glycocalyx senses this shear stress. Oh, here comes a big slug of blood. Tells the underlying endothelium, release nitric oxide, here comes the blood. The nitric oxide gets released, the smooth muscle in the artery relaxes, and the blood rushes back down into your hand, and your hand wakes back up. Because it kind of feels like sometimes your hand fell asleep, like you had your arm on your arm and cut off the flow temporarily. So some people get that pins and needles sensation. But when that blood rushes back down into the hand, that's called reactive hyperemia. So the test will calculate a score known as the reactive hyperemia index. We're essentially looking at, we stressed your artery, how well does it respond to that stressor? Normal is greater than 2.1. That means your arteries dilate 210% over the baseline. That tends to mean your body's pumping out nitric oxide on demand. If the score is less than 1.68, that's abnormal. That's evidence of endothelial dysfunction. The arteries can't release nitric oxide very efficiently, and that person's more prone to developing plaque in their arteries if you don't fix that condition. But optimal is between a 3 and 4. The arteries should triple or quadruple in size. And yes, he did beat you. I think you got 3.2 and you were 2.4 or 5 or somewhere in the range, but you're both normal and he beat you a little bit. So it's often the case where you just have to figure out what's still floating around in their blood and withdraw that so they can get to optimal. But sometimes people start out like near 1. You got a lot more work to do in those individuals.
Super fascinating. Anything else that you want to say about nitric oxide in terms of measuring it, or things that you look at here, or education that you provide to your patients that come to Apollo Cardiology?
Sure. So one of the things that we did today that anybody could do is just your blood pressure. Your blood pressure is a good surrogate for, is it likely that your body can make nitric oxide? First, start off like how to properly take a blood pressure. Your feet should be on the ground. You should be in a rested position. Your back should ideally be supported, and your arm should be at heart level. And you should use some type of blood pressure monitoring device that goes on your brachial artery. Now, there are devices that can go on the wrist, but those sometimes aren't well calibrated, so you want to steer clear of those when you're trying to get a true baseline. But ideally, your blood pressure should always be less than 120/80. I think Drew's central blood pressures were like 90s over 60s. That's what mine is. It's normal. There is no too low of a blood pressure unless you're symptomatic. If you were lightheaded, dizzy, had exercise intolerance, okay, are you taking any supplements or medications that are going to be pushing your blood pressure down? If you're not, if that's just naturally how you are, I'm not as concerned about that blood pressure being that low. But typically, 120/80 is kind of the cutoff you want to start looking at. If you're consistently 140/90, that might not be high risk, but it is a marker that your arteries don't release nitric oxide very efficiently, and we just got to figure out why that is.
Can I add something to that? Sure. Because I know we get this question a lot in clinics, and so maybe the viewers are having the same question is, hey, my blood pressure, I've checked it a few times last month and it was quote unquote normal. I saw my primary care doctor or I saw a specialist. And I generally tell people like more data can sometimes be helpful in this realm, especially with blood pressure, if you agree with that, Dr. Twyman. So it's like, check your blood pressure every day the same way. Do it for a few weeks. Keep a log. Then you get a trend. Because I generally don't make a decision off of just one number. Would you?
Very much so. I mean, like, unless somebody comes to my office and they're like 180/90, right. Like, okay, I got to act now. Like, I put out the 5-alarm firewall and figured it out. But correct, more data, and especially at home, like under your normal conditions. You know, there is a circadian, rhythm of your blood pressure. It changes throughout the day. And one way to really kind of see that fluctuation is to do a 24-hour blood pressure monitor. And there's a couple different vendors, but we have a newer device called the BioBeat. And it's kind of like one of the Holter monitors that just sticks on, and it uses photoplasmography or PPG to non-invasively measure the blood pressure. And it's well calibrated towards the brachial cuffs. So this little monitor sits on your chest, and every 15 minutes, it takes a measurement. And so then you get a full-on 24-hour average blood pressure, but more importantly, then you get to see like what times of days are some of these spikes when the blood pressure load goes over 140/90. Well, you're stuck in traffic, you just drank 5 espressos and an energy drink. Like, you'll figure out like what are the triggers that tend to spike it. But the key time is really seeing like, does your blood pressure drop while you sleep? Because your nocturnal blood pressure should drop 10-15% while you sleep. If it doesn't, that's sometimes a marker of sleep apnea. You're putting a lot of stress on the vascular system when you're not opening your airway, and your blood pressure won't drop at that point. Okay, well, figure out how to get their blood pressure to dip appropriately, and you really take a lot of that vascular stress off then. But yeah, a lot of times I get that question a lot, like, oh, I just have white coat hypertension. And today I'm wearing white, but often I don't wear white in this office because I don't want to influence people's ideas on their blood pressure with the colors. But white coat hypertension is just stress-induced hypertension. And we didn't talk about it today so much, but yeah, when we were doing that max pulse device, I need to look at your pulse wave velocity, how elastic the arteries are. That test also looks at heart rate variability, which is just an instantaneous measurement of how much stress your body is sensing. So sometimes we'll get an idea that if the person comes in and the blood pressure is elevated and they say like, it's just only high when I'm here, I'll look at that part of the test, and when I see that they have really high sympathetic tone, I'm like, it's possible. But I just tell them like, your body doesn't know the difference between your blood pressure's high because you're sitting in a doctor's office than when you're out in public, when you're in line for something and you get cut off in the traffic. Like, your body doesn't know the difference. The arteries are going to respond the same way. And it's really the load of it. Like, if your blood pressure's up for 1 minute a day, not a problem. But if it's hours and hours, that glycocalyx and underlying endothelium, it's just going to get damaged with that high shear stress.
Yeah. I just find daily blood pressure checks allows people to get involved in their health.
Correct.
Something easy, simple, and you can trust yourself, and you can go to your doctor and you guys can have that thorough conversation. So
one of the top things that's searched on YouTube, just in general, is why do I have high blood pressure? I think it's a good opportunity here to just cover something very basic. A lot of people that are listening today are dealing with high blood pressure or have a family member who has high blood pressure. What's going on?
I mean, they call it the silent killer for a reason, because the majority of people don't feel any symptoms with it. I mean, by the time you have symptoms, you're having headaches, vision changes, chest pain. It's been going on for quite a while, or you have a really, kind of bizarre, kind of like secondary reason why you have high blood pressure. But that being said, you want to start early in life and get a baseline. Your blood pressure should throughout life consistently be less than 120/80. Just because it tends to go higher when you're older doesn't mean that it's actually normal or good for the vascular system. It may be common that people's blood pressures are 150, 160 when they're 70 years old, but the blood pressure in the blood vessels, they don't care. But often we'll talk about patients that like, high blood pressure is not necessarily a disease. It may have an ICD-10 code and we can quote bill for it, but just a maladaptive response to the arteries trying to provide perfusion to the vital organs. But I often look at it as that you have to make sure that it's not a nitric oxide issue to begin with, because that is just so common. If you fix nitric oxide issues, often their blood pressure tends to improve significantly. But I think we were talking offline about is like, how do you do a good workup for hypertension? Well, first, take a good history. Most of the stuff is lifestyle induced. Like, what is this person fueling with, both mental activity and food-wise? Are they watching like toxic news and eating toxic food? Their blood pressure is probably going to be high from that. Is this person completely sedentary? Their blood pressure is likely to be high. They have level 10 stress. They're type A. Okay, well, you need cortisol for some things, but if you have cortisol that's high all the time, that's going to raise your blood sugar. It's going to constrict your arteries. You're going to age faster from the inside out, having high cortisol all the time. And then the forgot one is, how well do people sleep? I mean, most people are not sleeping 7.5, 8 hours and feeling super well rested the next day. if you don't sleep well, there's almost no chance you're going to have really great optimal blood pressure the rest of your life. So kind of work on the low-hanging fruit lifestyle things first. Then you can do these type of testing, like monitor your blood pressure at home and keep a log. If you have access to somebody who can put a 24-hour monitor on, that's really the gold standard to tell you like what your blood pressure is doing out in the environment. Then you can do a whole host of blood work to figure out, like, is it a metabolic issue? Is it high homocysteine, high uric acid? Some of the tests you guys did today, like, is it a nitric oxide issue? Genetics. There's many, many genes that affect blood pressure, and they tend to stack on each other. So often I have patients come in and say, like, I'm doing all those lifestyle things. I still have high blood pressure. I'm like, all right, well, let's check the genetics. And they'll have like 8, 9, 10 genes that tend to kind of be polygenic. It's not just one gene raising, it's 8 genes interacting. Okay, well, try to fix what you can with lifestyle and nutrients that are deficient, but sometimes medications are the right choice to lower the risk. And often these genetic testing will give you that kind of precision medicine. Oh, an ACE inhibitor will work best in this individual. A diuretic like spironolactone will work best in this individual. And so just be very precise with your treatments, and the blood pressures tend to come back down to where you want them to be.
So we'll get into blood work in a second, but let's talk about genetics since you brought it up, right? One of the things that you offer here at your clinic and with the patients that you work with is genetic screening, and to look at specifically, do you have certain genes that make you, in my case, for example, hyper reabsorber of cholesterol and lipids inside of the body? You mentioned some other examples of why you're looking at genes. If you could expand a little bit on that thread of some of the insights that you've gotten to personalize a patient's unique plan that you're putting together for them.
So patients that come to see me often are asymptomatic, and that's the goal. They don't want to go on to have a heart attack, stroke, or be on medicines for blood pressure per se, unless it's something that really needs to be done to reduce their risk. So the genetics that I typically offer initially for almost anybody, there's 4 big ones. LP(a), lipoprotein(a), which approximately 20% of the population has. It's a type of LDL, but it's more atherogenic and thrombogenic, meaning it's more likely to cause plaque in the arteries and more likely to cause the arteries to clot. And so you want to know, do you have high levels of this genetically inherited lipoprotein? So I check that in everybody. I will check apolipoprotein E as an echo, because that has an effect on your lipoproteins, your metabolic flexibility. People who have an ApoE4 tend to have more risk of insulin resistance, diabetes. And the ApoE4 carriers also have an increased risk of Alzheimer's, which may be diabetes type 3 of the brain. Doesn't mean you automatically get those diseases, but you're at higher risk. And so maybe you need to be more aggressive with your exercise routines. Your nutrition needs to be a little more locked in. 9p21, that's colloquially known as the heart attack gene. 9p21 mostly has an effect on the endothelium and underlying smooth muscle. So some people have this gene, and then that's the cause of why they have low nitric oxide to begin with. So those people end up more likely on supplements and medications to support their arteries. And then the 4th gene I often will check is KIF6, K-I-F and the number 6. People who have one abnormal copy of that gene have a 50% relative risk increase of cardiovascular disease. So they're more likely to have plaque in their arteries if they have this gene. But the carriers of the KIF6 gene also tend to be able to tolerate statins better than people who don't have that gene. So I'm not telling people that statins are for all, but if you have certain genes, certain meds may work better for those individuals. But KIF6 is also associated with aortic aneurysms. And the aorta is the blood vessel that lets the blood out of the heart and it takes the blood down for the rest of the body. But in some people, their aorta dilates out, and that's an aneurysm. If it gets to a certain dimension, there's more risk that that aorta will tear and cause a dissection, and that potentially could be a fatal consequence. So patients who have a KIF6 abnormality, they may be at higher risk for that, so they probably need more closely to be followed up with certain types of imaging, CTs or ultrasounds, to look at the aortic dimensions then.
So that's the genetic component of looking at a patient to further personalize for them, especially if those are individuals that are coming in a more preventative way, right? If somebody just had a cardiovascular event, you're not necessarily first going to genetics. You're just trying to treat that situation and deal with that situation. But it's nice for our audience here, who is in the same bucket often as me. I just turned 40, a year or two ago, and I'm really thinking about cardiovascular disease runs in my family. I've had a history of high LDL. The first time I got my ApoB measured, many years ago, when I didn't even really know what it meant, I don't even think the physician who was ordering it really fully understood. It was like 160 or something. I remember sending it to you saying, oh my gosh, my lipids are like totally jacked. And you're trying to make sure you're doing the right things and you're heading in the right direction, especially with heart disease being the number 1 killer. So the genetics is on the more advanced side of personalization, Not a lot of people are doing it. You're doing it here at Apollo. Let's talk about some of the things that is part of the standard sort of bucket of blood work that people are getting, and then taking it to the next level beyond standard of some of the other things that you look at from some of these advanced screenings. So let's talk about blood work for a second.
Sure. So we'll go down kind of like 3 buckets of blood work, but then I'll layer on that, like depending on what this blood work shows or the patient's concerns, there's 2 other big genetic panels that we can do. One that looks a little bit more at kind of the lipoproteins, like what's affecting their lipid metabolism. And then there's a bucket that tends to have more effect on their blood pressure, which I kind of mentioned a little bit ago. But the 3 ways that I think about looking at these advanced cardiovascular labs is, what are the ones that affect nitric oxide pathways? What are the ones that affect inflammation and oxidation? And then the 3rd bucket is the lipoproteins. Because on these advanced panels from Cleveland Heart Lab or Boston Heart Lab, which are kind of the 2 most common ones that most patients would utilize for this type of testing, there's hundreds of markers on these tests. And I can tell you that unless you've seen these panels before, they're sometimes overwhelming. It's nice that they're color-coded, green are optimal values, yellow is borderline, red's high or low. But if you took this to your doctor and they've never seen one, they're not going to understand how this all fits in. So back to bucket 1, the nitric oxide promoting ones. There's a urine test called urine microalbumin creatinine. This is a standard of care test that patients get when they have high blood pressure or diabetes. The more protein in your urine, the more likely that your kidneys are failing because of diabetes or high blood pressure. Those are the most common causes. There's some infections, some other rare causes, but those are the most common. But if you're leaking protein into your urine, that's a marker that the glycocalyx to the lining of the kidney arteries was getting impaired. And then you're peeing out protein into your urine, which is not supposed to be there. So it's like a quick check on, are your arteries healthy? If you're leaking protein, maybe not. Homocysteine is an amino acid. The higher the levels of homocysteine that you have, the more it's going to increase the level of a compound called asymmetric dimethylarginine, or ADMA. That ADMA lowers endothelial nitric oxide synthase, and then that lowers nitric oxide. So high homocysteine sometimes is associated with different methylation issues. There's MTHFR genes that some people inherit that affects this pathway. So if you have high homocysteine, it's usually a relatively easy fix using a methylated compound to bring that homocysteine down. High levels of uric acid is associated with the glycocalyx being oxidized and damaged. High uric acid often associated with if the person doesn't metabolize fructose well, if they're drinking more alcohol than their body can tolerate. Those are probably the most common reasons. Or they have kidney impairment to begin with, and they can't clear the uric acid through their kidneys. Those are kind of probably the most common nitric oxide promoting ones that I will initially look at. Then bucket 2 is going to be the oxidative stress and inflammation. So we're sitting here breathing oxygen, and we're breaking down the lunch that we ate through our mitochondria. But there's always going to be reactive oxygen species when that is happening. Your mitochondrial engines are making smoke as they're consuming those foodstuffs. So your body's always trying to make different antioxidants to prevent that from getting out of control. But on these blood panels, the oxidized markers that you would tend to look at is GGT, gamma glucotransferase. It usually shows up on like the liver function markers. But if you have high GGT levels, you're going to have relatively low levels of glutathione. And that's one of the master antioxidants that prevents all this oxidative stress. So if you have high GGT, that's often a problem for your oxidative markers. You can look at oxidized LDL, and then there's a test on Boston Heart Lab called the oxidized phospholipid ApoB. It's more sensitive at looking at which lipoproteins have already started to kind of rust or be oxidized. Those are the ones that tend to get trapped in the arteries more. That's the oxidation standpoint. Then the inflammatory ones, high sensitivity CRP, normal should be less than 1, but if you've had a recent infection, musculoskeletal injury, it can shoot up 50, 60, 70. It's not that your immune system turns on when there's a problem. It's that, does it turn off? That's really the concern. And if it doesn't turn off, well, that's kind of the next thing. Maybe you have an autoimmune condition, you got to go hunting for that. But there's some vascular-specific inflammatory markers. 2 big ones I look at is LP, PLA2, and myeloperoxidase. If either of those ones are elevated, that tends to mean the arteries are more inflamed, and there's more ability for the plaques that are in the arteries to rupture. Your body's always trying to take care of plaque, just kind of seal it off, put a cap over it, calcify it. But if there's a lot of inflammation in the plaques are more likely to rupture, and that's what leads the person to having a heart attack. So those are kind of the inflammatory and oxidative stress markers. And then the 3rd bucket is the lipoproteins, and this could be like an 8-hour podcast probably. But if you're going to make it simple, you do want to look at the traditional lipid panel, but you're only looking at to make sure the person does not likely have familial hyperlipidemia. So if their total cholesterol is over 300 milligrams per deciliter and their LDL cholesterol is over 190 milligrams per deciliter, it's possible that they have familial hyperlipidemia. That being said, is if they had a normal, quote, normal cholesterol in the past and it shot up this way, that's not going to be full-on genetic. There's probably going to be some metabolic reason why it shot up like that. But if you've been since a kid, your numbers are over 300, 190, you likely have a big genetic preload that's driving this. Then you can do a genetic test to figure out which gene that person inherited that made their lipids look that way. But that's not very common in the general population. Maybe 1 in 200, 1 in 300 people have that type of genotype. On the traditional panel, the main thing I would look at is just triglycerides. And in pretty much all comers, I generally like to see triglycerides less than 80. It's not a perfect test, but if it's less than 80, they're likely not to be severely insulin resistant. So it's a starting point. I really don't look at HDL-C as much of a predictor. It's much more important to look at the particle count of HDL. Then that gets into where we're really kind of looking at these advanced panels, is looking at the lipoproteins themselves. And so the arteries, they have this lining called the endothelium and then the underlying intima. This plaque only gets in the arteries if an ApoB containing particle gets retained here and leaves its cargo here, and then the plaque starts building up like a pimple in the artery wall. I often use this tennis ball as the analogy of what a lipoprotein is all about. Cholesterol is a waxy compound that is produced in the liver. It's produced in many of your cells, but the liver produces the ones that are going to basically be transported in these lipoproteins. Cholesterol is a critical nutrient. You're not going to be alive without cholesterol. You make your sex hormones with it, your cell membranes, your bile acids, your vitamin D. Without cholesterol, you're not alive. But cholesterol is waxy, so it's not going to float in your liquid blood, much like oil and vinegar won't. So the liver makes these lipoproteins, these lipid protein carriers. And I use the tennis ball analogy because the lipoproteins are generally spherical. So the cholesterol is going to go inside. Triglycerides, which are energy for the cells, go inside because not every cell is making its own energy supply. The fat-soluble vitamins go inside. Phospholipids, which are building blocks for the cells, go inside. And there's different immune complexes that all go inside. And then the liver pumps these things out, ships them through your liquid blood. And then the organs that need something are going to bind to it, take out what it needs. And then it has to ship it back to the liver. And this is where often you can figure out what genetic issues are going on in this person. Is it that their body's producing too much cholesterol and thus too many of these lipoproteins? Or is it an issue that they don't make enough receptors to get them out of the circulation? Kind of think of like a docking station. They don't have many docking stations. These are the LDL receptors. And these things just keep circulating around the blood vessels, trying to find an off-ramp. If they eventually find the off-ramp, no harm, no foul. But if the glycocalyx has been damaged by these microplastics or air pollution or metals, then it's more likely that they end up sticking to the artery lining like Velcro, and then they could kick off this cascade. So back to the long-winded answer is that you do want to look at the actual number of the particles carrying the cholesterol around, because it's not necessarily the cargo that's a problem. The cargo, if it doesn't end up in the arteries, no harm, no foul. It's the lipoproteins that get stuck here, and that's what you want to measure. And so the test is the LDL particle number is the lion's share that most people will have, but you can encapsulate it by looking at apolipoprotein B or ApoB. So if the LDL particle is the tennis ball, ApoB is this white stripe on the tennis ball. The white stripe is basically what holds this thing together in a sphere. It also acts as a ligand or a key. So when it's coming back to that LDL receptor, it's going to bind to it and then it gets pulled out. So ApoB is on the outside of all the particles, the LDL particles, the VLDLs, the ILDLs, and LPLA, if you got it, it's on the outside of them. So you can just count up all the particles that potentially get stuck in your arteries by looking at the value of ApoB. And then there's different graphs you can look at and say, like, okay, if your ApoB is 170, well, compared to your peers, that's going to be well above the 90th percentile. 90% people will have values lower than that. And then you want to go look at the arteries. Okay, is this actually causing damage to your arteries? And that's what all the testing you guys are starting to do here, and some of the testing you've had done in the past, such as that Clearly scan.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that, Michael. Neel, I want to have you kind of chime in a little bit. There's a lot of people that are listening today who have insurance through their job or part of, a hospital group like a Kaiser or some other group that's out there. And even just getting the basic labs at a young age to be more preventative sometimes can be a little bit challenging. Any suggestions of how people can ask their doctor or physician or find somebody more open-minded within the system? Maybe not everybody has access to a Michael or can make it out to St. Louis. And what are beyond, most people just know cholesterol, LDL. They don't know about a lot of these other things like ApoB, lipoprotein, Lp(a). Any suggestions of which ones are starting to come out that people can start to ask for a little bit? They might have to do it really nicely with their doctor, but yeah, just navigating the system a little.
Yeah, so that's always a challenge because as more data comes out over the years, you want to kind of tailor healthcare toward that new data to kind of help either prevention and or secondary prevention. EKG is very basic that I think most people will get. In a traditional lipid panel, you'll get your LDL. But recently, over the last maybe few months, we're kind of debunking some myths that an ApoB can't be ordered because it's too expensive. I looked into it in our lab, and it only costs $3. So it is possible to get ApoB. I think that the traditional viewpoint was, what do I do with this information?
Yeah, the doctor may not know how to interpret it or what to decide.
And that, I think, is what's limited. So it's kind of like, okay, a 40-year-old has a normal stress test. Okay, great. So I can tell them that at this moment, they don't have a significant narrowing in their heart artery to cause them pain or limitations when they're exercising. Now that might have some value. Hey, great, you can continue to do your exercise. But the questions that patients are asking and getting to your point is, are there other ways or metrics of trying to capture when we are younger or even when we're older, a little bit more representative picture of my health or my vascular health? So just know that having an NMR also, like in our system, I think it costs $40 or $50. Not really exorbitant,
not astronomical,
but doable. And especially with the ApoB is more causative as opposed to correlative. So you can get that. And if it's just a few dollars, it does actually give you a lot more insight into what is happening. The other thing that I have asked people to do, because this is a traditional panel, is add fasting insulin, right? That tells you a lot more about your ability to handle glucose and then that whole kind of interplay between that and the vascular health. So the things that I tell people to add are, just to kind of recap, you can ask for the NMR, the ApoB, because the NMR, just to be more clear, it'll tell you the particle number and the particle size.
Which is what Michael was talking about earlier.
Correct. So the smaller the particle number, the more damaging it can be. The more particle numbers, the more damaging it can be. The analogy I use, you use a tennis ball, I use cars on a highway. Yep. The more cars on a highway, the more likely you are to have kind of pileups and accidents. So NMR, ApoB, and then the fasting insulin. And I think that's a pretty good starting place for that. One
of the common comments that I get, I think we got some last time, Michael, you were on the podcast, was people saying, my doctor just doesn't order a lot of these. So anything about, I've often found that sometimes it's about being nice, but then also, Neel, I want to see if you have any tips, because you're more recently sort of in the sort of traditional system. Any ways that people you'd recommend sort of finagle to get their doctor? And is it ever okay to just say, all right, forget it, I'm just going to go find somebody new?
Well, I'll tell you what I just said is actually on AHA guidelines. There's the traditional route. Dr. Twyman had mentioned, if your LDL is above 190 milligrams per deciliter, that automatically is red flag to kind of really start things. But if you look at their workflow and their protocol, CVD risk enhancers, they call it. And under there is lipoprotein(a), and there is ApoB. So it's in there. It's in the guidelines.
I guess what I'm hearing is that people are saying, my doctor just doesn't want to order this.
Yeah, or again, it could be a legitimate, I think it's too expensive, and they just don't know. So we just stop there. But I would encourage people to say, hey, these are a part of the actual guidelines that, hey, this is a risk enhancer. I just want to know my risk for the next 30 years and I'm 40 years old. I think that a lot of doctors have actually taken to that.
Yeah. Michael, anything you want to add to that?
Sure, like 2 points. One is that there's a lot of great direct-to-consumer lab companies now. Yeah. Some of them are just even finger sticks. It's going to be a little bit more than $3 or $40 sometimes, but not terrible. And you can do this test at the comfort of your own home and the results get sent to you. Now, the biggest challenge is just how do you interpret it? And so hopefully you're learning stuff through here and you've seen other videos and you have an idea of like, okay, my numbers are high. I might want to do something about this. But you should be able to get any of this testing pretty affordable at home and just have an honest conversation with the doc. Like, hey, I can make it easy for you. Like, this is the test. This is how you do it. It's often just lack of knowledge. Like, well, how do I order this test? If it's not in their electronic medical system, it's like foreign to them. And to your point is that most doctors are very well-meaning, but they don't know cost of things very well. Like, I wasn't trained this way. They don't tell you like, well, NACO is going to be this many dollars, a cost this much. You have to figure that out later. And so the patient asks you like, well, how much will this be? Most doctors just literally don't have an idea because they were never taught it themselves.
Yeah, and the price may vary greatly depending on the insurance, cash pay, etc. Michael, since you mentioned it, any of your favorite sort of direct-to-consumer labs that you want to mention or give a shout out to?
There's a company called Siphox, Siphox. They are the first one that I have seen that does ApoB at home, and it was very easy to do. There's a lab called Empower. They actually will do the cholesterol balance test that you can get on that Boston Heart Lab panel. So the cholesterol balance test is the one that tells you, are you a hyperproducer of cholesterol, or are you a hyperabsorber of cholesterol, or are you both? I often get that question like, well, how can I get it? Because I don't have access to the Boston. This Empower is direct to consumer. You do the finger stick at home, send it in, you get the results. The side note is they actually send it to Boston and Boston runs it for them, but you at least have access to it if you're interested in that type of information.
That's great. I know one of the sponsors, and I've used them well before they were a sponsor of this podcast, is called Life Force. Tony Robbins and Peter Diamandis, big fans of them. They have a company. It's not an at-home test per se that you do yourself, but every quarter they send a phlebotomist to your house in most major cities across the US. They take your blood work, they put it in. I love their interface. I've shared before, sort of my breakdown of everything. They do ApoB and some of these other items that are there. Yes, full disclosure, they are a sponsor, but even well before they were a sponsor, I was using them, I was recommending them. And I think it's a monthly subscription. It's about like $120 a month. So not like super, cheap. But as part of that, you also get doctor interpretation as well too. Every quarter you get a 30-minute call. So we'll put the links for all those in the show notes below. So we covered, some of the top laboratory test things that you'd be doing here, how people can approach it and ask their doctor if they don't have access to a functional medicine cardiologist like yourself, Michael. We also covered, genetics, and we talked about some of the other key components that play into healthy blood vessels. I'd like to take a moment here and just talk about this idea of, I'm going to come back to diet, because even though you shared your ideas and thoughts, often people ask, what is the best diet to protect the heart? And there's a lot of different messaging that they get out there. They'll talk to somebody who's in the carnivore space and they'll hear one thing. They'll talk to somebody who's a little bit more, what I would call in sort of the evidence-based camp. They're going to hear recommendations like keep your saturated fat to less than 10% or 20% of your calories. Eat a diet that generally keeps your LDL down and keeps your omegas high, and make sure you have enough fiber and a few of those recommendations. Are there any fundamentals besides staying away from ultra-processed foods that you recommend to your patients? So we have the nitrates and making sure you get ample amount of nitrates as part of that. We have staying away from ultra-processed foods and greatly minimizing them as part of the diet. Is there anything else that you feel strongly about when it comes to dietary recommendations when it comes to protecting the heart?
Absolutely. I have this conversation with every patient, is that, the timing of your meals and the seasonal portion of meals is probably as important as what you're actually fueling the body with. Now, the data in the conventional cardiology world is going to talk more about the benefits of a Mediterranean type diet. And that's always a good template. If you don't know where to start with the Mediterranean type template. But if you're going to be more kind of data oriented, well, first start with the time of day. My general rule is you want to eat during daylight hours wherever you're at. If it's dark out, stop eating so that the gut and liver know it's time to go to bed. Second thing is that we're not designed to eat the exact same foods 365. Until 100 years ago, if your food wasn't growing outside your door, or you didn't hold on to it, canning it, you didn't have access to it. So in St. Louis, there's 4 seasons. So I get the question about I want to do keto diet. Well, if you're going to do keto diets, evolutionary, it would only made sense to be ketotic in the wintertime in St. Louis because there wouldn't have been a lot of fruits and vegetables growing at this time. But now we're starting to head into spring and summer. That's when you would have been having more carbohydrates. So having a seasonal approach is also very important. After that, then you can use this blood work to kind of guide you. We talked a lot about insulin resistance. You can look at your fasting insulin level, your glucose levels, your HOMO-IR scores. Are you likely insulin resistant? You can also backtrack it and look at some of the lipoproteins. If they have very high triglycerides, over 80, if they have a lot of these small, dense LDLs, if they have low HDL particles, that's often a mark of insulin resistance. That person's probably going to need to be more careful on the volume of carbohydrates, because carbs are neither good nor bad. There's just a tolerance that people have, largely based on their skeletal muscle health. And so that is somewhat of a non-negotiable. I have multiple copies of Dr. Lyon's book sitting there, is that people have to get their high quality protein so that they get enough leucine to trigger muscle growth, because the metabolism is happening in the muscles. So the protein is basically the same for everybody. It's like you need at least 90 grams, figure out what sources you want to get it from. Then the fat component to it, there is a big variability as well in that. The ApoE genotype also has a big role. So if you're an ApoE4 carrier, sometimes these higher fat diets don't always work as well from them. From a lipid standpoint, it may be great for reducing body fat or their, brain works better. Great, but they're probably going to have the side effect of we got to fix their lipids potentially. And then on this Boston Heart Lab panel, you can see how well is this person absorbing the saturated fats that they've been eating? Trans fats, which are, margarine and really fried oils, that should be minimal in your diet. You shouldn't be trying to actively add that, but sometimes you eat packaged foods, you're eating out, you're going to get exposed to those type of oils. And then the omega-3s. The omega-3s are critically important for vascular health, lowering inflammation. And the DHA component, very, very important for brain health. You need DHA for the neurons to work together well. So you think of DHA as your cell phone charge. The higher your DHA, the better your brain tends to work. And then there's the monounsaturated fats. So this is the bedrock of the Mediterranean diet. So you're getting a lot of monounsaturated fats in the diet. So you can kind of guidepost by this lab, like, hey, this person's pretty carb tolerant. So whatever they're doing is working for them. Or do they need to dial back not only the total grams, but their meal threshold? And then the fats, it's pretty straightforward. Like if they come in like, hey, I'm following a high fat keto diet or I'm a carnivore and their saturated fat numbers are through the roof and their ApoB's, 190, well, you got to have the conversation like, are you going to plan to stay on this diet and be at higher vascular risk potentially? Or are you going to switch and take less saturated fat and do more mono and polyunsaturated fat like omega-3s, not, seed oils, and see like, okay, what does their lipid panel look like on this new type of fat concentration that's coming in their diet? What are the arteries doing? Again, like I said, I'm from Missouri. Show me that it works for you. Like I'm pretty flexible that, there's not a perfect diet that everybody should be doing. It's very individualized, but you have to test and retest to make sure that you're not kind of putting yourself behind the 8 ball from a vascular standpoint.
So just to recap here, would you say this is a fair statement? Every diet from an advanced precision medicine, cardiology, functional medicine, cardiology perspective, every diet out there can be supportive for heart health, and every diet done incorrectly for your sort of background, genes, metabolic health, skeletal muscle mass could actually be worse for heart health. It's about personalizing it to make sure that it fits for you. Is that a fair statement?
Very much so, yeah. It's individualized to the person who's sitting in front of you. I mean, like one of the first questions I have on my intake form is, do you know your maternal haplotype? You can get that off, the 23andMe data. Your maternal haplotype tells you where did your original mitochondria come from. So if you're more equatorial, some of these higher carb diets probably would work better for you. But if you're more Northern European, maybe these higher fat diets might work for you. And so it gives you a starting point to have the conversation with people if they know the maternal haplotype.
That's great. Neel, anything you want to add in on the dietary side for the conversation?
Yeah, and I think it would just be a point of, so like omega-3 indexes, recent study when they analyzed the Framingham data, and they said that people who had higher omega-3 to 6 ratio had an equivalent amount of lower risk for CVD or cardiovascular disease. So in which form that you get it, obviously is your personalized decision, but having a higher omega-3 intake compared to your omega-6 has been shown to be vascular protective.
Yeah, being high on the omega index.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
We've had Dr. Bill Harris on this podcast here, who is the inventor of the Mega Quant. And I always share with my audience, that was actually the pivotal test that got me to stop being vegan. Mm-hmm. Not that you can't be a vegan and have high omega-3s
Absolutely.
and sort of moderate levels of omega-6. And obviously there's 3, 6, 9. I was sort of flip-flop. I had super high omega-6s,
right,
very low omega-3s, which also probably describes that why, I was starting to feel like my brain wasn't turning on. And obviously there's plant sources of omega-3s. There's algae and other things like that I wasn't sure. Do they actually move the needle forward? And Dr. Bill Harris did say that in all their research they've seen, these plant algae that people are using to get omega-3s do work. And so whether you're plant-based or something else, just making sure you're in the ideal omega index range. But if somebody works with you, Michael, and they get the Boston Heart Panel done, they have the omega index also inside of there too.
Correct.
Fantastic. Since we are on the topic of omegas, obviously, let's move over into the category of supplementation. If you're not eating enough fish, you can supplement with omega-3s, fish oils, or algae, as we just mentioned. And would you say that that's one of the supplements that you might recommend for individuals if they're trying to protect their heart as they age?
It's potential, and it will be based off the blood work, but I'm always going to recommend getting it from the root source whenever possible.
Diet first.
Diet first.
This is why you took us to
the
best seafood restaurant in town over here in
Correct.
St.
Yeah,
Louis.
took it to a seafood place, and we loaded up on the seafood tower. And yeah, I always want people to try to get through dietary sources when they have access to it. Can you supplement? Yes, but it's sort of like the same question with like red light therapy. You always use that after they've kind of exhausted their regular ways of getting it. And it's theoretical. The omega-3s that come in supplementation, they might make your blood levels look better, but are they always actually getting into the cells and activating things that you want them to activate? And that's sometimes a moving question, and I don't know the answer to that. Like, does it actually cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the neurons? I don't know. Maybe. There's probably some smart people watching this, and they can tell me I'm wrong on this, but I always would say, like, supplement if you need to, but it's preferred not to.
Yeah, you see that this is a very vocal group of people online who talk about phospholipids and things like, I forgot the main one that's out there, this company called Body Bio that makes a particular type of phospholipid, and they're saying that it's not just about the omega-3s, you got to have the right type of these phospholipids. Does this ring a bell at all?
Right, and it's like the omega-3s, are on a triglyceride backbone. There's the SN1, SN2, SN3 position. And my understanding is that like it needs to be in the SN2 position to actually be like a key and get into the receptors. And nobody knows exactly if, once you take it out of the fish and put it through the process, does it stay in that position?
Got it. Well, at least from the data that we have right now, being in the optimal omega index we know is good. So however you get there, dietary first. What are some of the other top supplement recommendations that you have for individuals? And you mentioned a few of them earlier on the topic of nitric oxide. So you mentioned the beet supplements that are out there, but there are also some advanced nitric oxide lozenges if somebody's not producing enough. And here's my question. For somebody like me who's in a good range, based on some of the testing that I went through today here, but wants to get in the optimal range, should I be considering some of these nitric oxide supplementation?
I think the answer is probably yes. I think, once you have any evidence of the arteries are getting stiff on one of these tests, or you have evidence of plaque on a carotid scan or calcium scan or a clearly scan, then you would do everything possible to stop the process right there. And so think of it as things that are trying to help put the force field up higher so no further damage happens. Could you kind of use it like an antibiotic where like there's a lot of issues, you use it, kind of put the fire out? You could, but you also say like, my goal is not to live 10 years, I want to go 40 more years. And so it's kind of a risk-reward thing. Is like, if vascular disease is still the number one thing taking people out, then do everything you can do to protect the vascular system. And often it's doing something that boosts nitric oxide if it's not optimal. There's a couple different companies that make lozenges. Dr. Nathan Bryan, who I know you've had on the show and I've had the pleasure to speak with at multiple conferences, he has a few different patents on different lozenges that have science behind them that actually shows that nitric oxide is getting released when it dissolves in the saliva, and then when you swallow it, it helps kind of recouple that endothelial nitric oxide synthase enzyme so that your body's natural production starts working well. So he has a company, N101, that has those lozenges. And then there's a company, in full disclosure, I speak for them sometimes just educationally, it's Calroy. They have a product called Vascanox. It's a capsule, and it has about a 24-hour duration of action. It also releases hydrogen sulfide, and that hydrogen sulfide in and of itself is a vasodilator, so the arteries get bigger. But hydrogen sulfide acts somewhat like the phosphodiesterase inhibitors, so the Viagra type medications. So you're putting more nitric oxide into the system, and then the hydrogen sulfide keeps it around longer, so that works better for longer periods of time, let's say. So those are kind of the workhorses. I either use with these lozenges or this Vascanox product if the person is low in nitric oxide and needs to be supplemented.
On the topic of supplementation, one area that's come up a lot on this podcast here and on our newsletter is the idea of anything that can help people address the plaque buildup that happens in the arteries. One of the tests that you sent me in for was the Clearly test. You mentioned it earlier. We did a whole podcast that was a breakdown of my Clearly test, what people can learn from it, but just big picture if people didn't listen. The Clearly test is really one of the first sort of, I don't know what the right term is, but predictive, earliest sort of diagnosis of heart disease that would be there. How would you describe it?
I think it's the most sensitive test that's been invented to date, because by the time somebody normally comes to a cardiologist with symptoms, chest pain with exercise, they have a 70-80% blockage in their arteries. I'm holding up a diagram of an artery, and this is what it would look like. Your artery is severely 80% stenosed, you're likely going to have symptoms when you're exercising. You can't get enough oxygen nutrients past this. But this didn't happen overnight. These plaques usually are harder plaques, and they're generally more stable. You'll have symptoms every time you exercise at a certain heart rate for the most part, but these aren't the plaques that necessarily rupture and cause heart attacks. It tends to be the less severe stenotic plaques, the softer plaques that tend to be the problem. And those are the plaques you can't feel until it's too late. Half the time somebody has a heart attack, they had no symptoms until that heart attack occurred. And so the Clearly scan helps try to find this plaque at the earlier stages. You start with a CT coronary angiogram. So you have to have an IV placed. If you don't have a low resting heart rate, they often give you a beta blocker medication to slow your heart rate down. That just helps cut down on a little bit of the motion artifact as your heart continues to beat, and they're taking a picture of a moving object. They take a picture of your arteries, and it looks at the degree of stenosis. Do you have a blockage in your arteries? That's not the best case for the CT angio for the Clearly. You're mostly looking at what's going on in the walls of the artery. How much plaque is in an iceberg below the surface. That's what you want to look at with the Clearly. And Clearly is basically just an AI software algorithm that they upload the CT angiogram images into, and then the machine learning software, voxel by voxel, slices the artery and looks at what's in the walls of the artery. And it quantifies the total plaque volume, and it will break it down to 3 buckets: calcified plaque, soft plaque, and low density soft plaque. And it's those soft and low density plaques that more likely you go on to rupture and cause a heart attack. And while a calcium score test is an outstanding test, it cannot see that soft plaque. And that's really the question is how much soft plaque does somebody have in their arteries? Because that gives you an idea that person's had a lot of endothelial dysfunction. Their glycocalyx has been trashed for years, and they've had a lot of the smoldering fire in their arteries, and they're laying this plaque down. You can still intervene before they have their events, but you have to know that it's there first. And in your situation, it was more about that you had these high ApoBs. This is why if you do all the right lifestyle things, you can still have a relatively low total plaque volume. You didn't have advanced plaque in your arteries. Your arteries didn't have 90% plaques in them just because you had a high ApoB. That tends to mean you had healthy nitric oxide levels for years and years and low inflammation. Your arteries never developed this problem. So the Clearly just really helps quantify people who are higher risk, more likely to go on to have a heart attack, need stents, bypass, or die, versus people, no, stay the course, lifestyle, supplement, medicate when necessary.
And in all fairness, when I got it done, I was 40, so I'm still pretty young.
Correct.
And so things could happen over a period of time. When I was younger, I was on a vegetarian diet, probably not a healthy vegetarian diet initially. Then I went on a very processed vegan diet, and then I went on a raw food diet when the whole raw food movement was very popular. So a lot of my adult life, I was either young with a very healthy body that could kind of deal with a lot of this. And for a period of 10 years, from 18 to 28, I was on a very clean vegan diet towards the end of that. So I'm also paying attention to individuals that are out there that are saying, hey, okay, now that I'm 40 years old, I am mindful about how much ApoB is floating around between the ages of 40 to 100, right? And we'll talk about that in a second when we talk about prescription interventions that are there. So going back to the topic, we were talking about supplementation. We went into Clearly. We were talking about soft plaque. If somebody does find that they have some soft plaque built up inside of their body, are there supplement recommendations that they could possibly undertake to help potentially address it?
So we've talked about some of them already. So the nitric oxide boosters are going to be helpful to basically stop doing damage, put the force fields up so the body has a better shot at improving what's below the surface of the water, the iceberg. The omega-3s, that's also very important, help basically put a thicker cap over the plaque, decrease the inflammation in the system so the plaque doesn't rupture. Kyloic garlic, it's a particular type of garlic. It's a Japanese garlic, and it's been studied. There's trials at UCLA that they're doing, looking at arteries with calcium scores. Those patients' calcium score tests tend not to get worse, and sometimes the calcium score test was actually backing up or improving with kyloic garlic. Usually the dose is 600 milligrams twice a day, and before I get asked, well, can I just chop it up and put it in my spaghetti? Of course, add garlic to whatever you like, but it's the dose that is the drug, and so you want to have the exact dose. And
that garlic, I believe, we wrote a newsletter on this, we'll link to in the show notes. It's an aged garlic, so that seems to be playing a role in it as well.
Correct. It's the aging process that has an effect on some of the compounds that then the actual garlic releases. It's not just the the polyphenols and other stuff that comes in it.
Great. Anything else that you've mentioned? I think that there's a few sort of more advanced supplements that are there that you offer in your practice, you recommend to individuals.
Yeah, the one that would be the Arteries. It's a glycocalyx promoter. It's mostly been studied in carotid plaques at helping the soft plaques basically delipidate or shrink. There's no reason that it wouldn't suspect that would help with the coronaries. It just has not been studied. But, personally taking arterial just in the hope that it helps any soft plaque I have in the system. And then I have multiple patients on it for other reasons, and we'll eventually repeat clearly on them to see, did those soft plaques regress with it? But then getting into like pharmaceuticals, the ones that have the best data are generally going to be the statins for those that can tolerate it. And a lot of that data, is with rosuvastatin or Crestor. You don't necessarily need to go all the way to 40 milligrams every day to get the benefit. Often many patients I have just on 5 milligrams daily or twice a week, and just try to get some of the anti-inflammatory lowering benefits of the statins. There's some data that it helps with the glycocalyx. It doesn't make it so impermeable, but it does tend to make it thicker. And then it also is going to help with keeping down some of the oxidative stress that the glycocalyx is sensing. So you stop doing damage when the statin is on board. It's not all about just lowering the cholesterol particles with it.
Let's talk about statins in the category of prescription interventions that are there. Generally, there's been a lot of confusion about statins. You address some of this here. There's also been some concern in the wellness community of like, oh, I don't want to deal with statins. I don't want to take them because of potential side effects, mitochondrial issues, muscle issues that are there. What's real and what's not, and what's a little bit in between?
It's a great debate, and it's one of those things where it's like, no, I don't believe that statins should be in the water and we should all be taking them. And I don't believe that they're poisons that nobody should. If it was all magical and nobody had heart attacks, we would have already seen that, because almost every patient I ever saw when I was in my fellowship that came in having a heart attack was already on a lot of these medicines, because the majority of heart attacks are repeat. It's not all the first timers having heart attacks. So if it stopped all the heart attacks, we would have been done. We'd all be taking them. So what was the part that we're missing? It was the unmitigated oxidative stress, inflammation, and this endothelial dysfunction. Those things aren't fully responsive to statins. That's why it's not a magic bullet. It's one tool. And the major side effect that's across the board, even in the trials, it's going to be muscle-related symptoms. Muscle pain, weakness. I've honestly, in my 20 plus years of being a physician, I've never seen a case of rhabdomyolysis from a statin. When I was in the military, I saw hundreds of cases of rhabdomyolysis from exercise and the July heat in South Carolina, where the DIs would go a little bit too hard sometimes. But rhabdomyolysis is when the muscle cells die. It looks like you're peeing out blood when that happens. I've never seen a case of that from a statin. That being said, the muscle symptoms are real. In the trials, they may say it's only a couple percentage points of people have it. In real life, it's 10, 20, 30% of people might have some symptoms if you really dive into it. But is it sometimes bad enough that they have to stop it? Not always. But I would often do some of these advanced testing, say like, who's the person who's more likely to have side effects than not? And the people who tend to get more of the muscle symptoms across the board, it tends to be the people who are vitamin D deficient. So they have a level under 30 milligrams per deciliter. I usually shoot for a level of 50 to 60 on vitamin D to reduce the risk of muscle symptoms with statins. They have low coenzyme Q10 levels. CoQ10 is produced in your liver, but it also gets depleted with statin use or beta blocker use. If you're going to supplement with CoQ10, generally you want to supplement to get your level back over 3. It's never been fully elucidated that if you supplement people just routinely with CoQ10 that they don't get muscle symptoms, but some people benefit, and there's no harm in supplementing with CoQ10. If you're hypothyroid, if your thyroid's underactive, you're much more likely to have muscle symptoms with statins. And then there's some of the genetic reasons why. So if people have an ApoE4 allele, they tend not to tolerate the highest dose of statins. They tend to get a lot more muscle symptoms or glucose dysregulation issues with it if you're pumping it at 40, 80 milligrams of some of the higher potency statins. And then there's some genes you can look at on some of the blood tests. And then there's also the buccal swab, that GB Insight panel that you've done that looked at, do you have certain genes that tend to cause 4 to 5 times increased risk of having muscle pains on statins? And you had one abnormal one that has an effect on carnitine levels. So those are the people that says that if you're going to use a statin, it should be very, very low dose and maybe intermittent dose. But there's so many other good tools out there right now. So I don't understand the debate where I don't take a statin. Okay, what are you willing to take to lower your risk? Because if it's just the statins off the board, I have a lot of other tools we can use. But it's a different conversation when they're like, I don't want to touch my cholesterol levels at all. Okay, well then we have to have that conversation. If they're just concerned about the muscle symptoms, we can find something that will work for them.
Neel, anything you want to add to the prescription intervention conversation here?
Yeah, ezetimibe, I think, to be honest, in fellowship wasn't used as much. Statins were the mainstay.
Can you describe what that is and why somebody would use it?
Yeah, absolutely. So ezetimibe, or also known as Zetia, the difference is that statins will actually reduce the production of the LDL, or the carriers, the tennis ball in your analogy. Ezetimibe or Zetia will actually block the reabsorption of the cholesterol to kind of, in a way, reduce how much LDL your liver has to make. A lot of people will tolerate that a little bit better. Sometimes you can get some GI side effects, but depending on where you fall, whether you're a hyperabsorber or not, Zetia might work enough to get your ApoB down, and then in surrogacy, your LDL as well.
One of the things you recommended for me was ezetimibe, Michael. Just talk about that intersection. What did you see that you suggested that? And generally, I don't know if it's, somebody told me that ezetimibe is not truly in the category of a statin because it's blocking the reabsorber, but I generally think that people put it in that same category. Is that correct?
They may, but it's not a statin. Just flat out, it's not. It's a cholesterol reabsorption inhibitor, and it's working in the intestine and in the kind of the bile ducts. The analogy I think about is, are you a hyperproducer of cholesterol or are you a hyperabsorber? So sometimes I will use an analogy of a bathtub filling up with water. So if the bathtub's filling up with water and you don't want it to overflow, there's three big things you can do. You can go to the faucet and shut the faucet off. If you're a hyperproducer of cholesterol, then you will have high levels of lanthosterol, desmosterol, and those compounds get produced into cholesterol. So that's the location where statins work. Or if you're statin intolerant or just, hey, I'm not taking this stuff, bempedoic acid, which is Nexletol, works in a pathway 2 doors down from where the statins work. If people are intolerant to medications or just they're trying to go supplements because their levels weren't so high, this is where red yeast rice and bergamot work. They're HMG co-reductase inhibitors like statins. They're just not as potent. So you're just dialing back the amount of cholesterol produced in the liver. Less of these tennis balls get shipped out. The second thing you could do is you could open up the drain in the bathtub. This is where the PCSK9 inhibitors would work. These are mostly Repatha, Praluent, and there's elasclerin. There's companies working on oral forms, but they're a year or two away from my understanding of hitting the market. But PCSK9 is an enzyme. It's an enzyme that breaks down your LDL receptors. So sitting outside of your liver is these cargo docking stations grabbing these particles, these ApoB particles as they go by, and brings them back into the liver. I told you guys last night that I had a great-grandmother who lived to 106 years old. I have multiple family members who have very low ApoBs in the 40s on no medications. And when I did the testing on them, they had loss of function PCSK9 genes. So they basically got built in Repatha. They're never going to have high lipoproteins because their body just clears these things very efficiently. So it's basically like the water can be blasting into the bathtub, but the drain is wide open. Water goes straight out. The water is now out. Well, the only way cholesterol leaves your body is through your intestines. But in about 1 in 5 people, there's a gate, essentially, the Niemann C1 like 1 receptor. It basically is open and keeps letting a lot of this cholesterol reflux back to the liver. It's basically like, hey, we made this stuff. It took us a lot of energy to make it. We don't necessarily want it to leave the body. Let's just save it. Everybody resorbs a little bit, but about 1 in 5 people sends back a lot. And that was in your case. You were hyperabsorbing a lot of these sterols from the gut. So with ezetimibe on board, it's basically like making sure that once the water gets out of the drain, it's going to go into the main line and go out to the sewer. And it cannot come back. Okay, so 3 big levers. You can either shut off the faucet, open up the drain, or make sure that the water in the main line goes out to the sewer.
Yeah, I think we started on ezetimibe last year. It was June I started taking it. My ApoB last year before I started on ezetimibe, so this would be February 2023, was 144, which is still not the highest that it's ever been. It's like, was like 170, 180. I'll fact check that and go check that old test. And then by June, end of June, early July, it had gotten down to 86. And I think that I was around like mid 70s-ish through this time period. And then about last month, one of my buddies, Mark Mayuhouse, who's part of my men's group in Los Angeles, he like got me hooked on this beef chili from Air One. You've probably heard about Air One. It's like that most expensive grocery store in Los Angeles. And I literally was eating this beef chili for like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And even while I was on ezetimibe, I don't know the dosage, you probably know better than me. We can find out and kind of put it on there. Obviously, everybody needs to go talk to their doctor, see what they're a good fit for, but I'm just using it as a reference. Even though I was still on ezetimibe, but I was eating this chili for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, my ApoB jumped back up to like 100, right? That was there. But I was literally having like saturated fat for like breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that, it's mostly ground beef or bison. And that's like 80% fat, 20% lean typically. And a lot of that being saturated fat. I kind of got off the chili for a little bit. I know we did a test today. It still may not be long enough of a time period for it to sort of lower, but I'm hoping to bring it back. What should somebody like me, who's generally had a good clearly scan, right, in the optimal category, pretty good endopat, you've seen the rest of my labs that are there. What should I be shooting for if I'm trying to not roll the dice as I continue to get older? Where would you like to see my APO be?
It's going to be nuanced, because I'm always going to go back to what is the health of the glycocalyx and the endothelium. Because if your force field's up, you're much less likely that these ApoBs are getting through the glycocalyx and getting retained. So if you have a healthy endothelium and glycocalyx, I care, but not nearly as much as if you have severely damaged glycocalyx. The reason that this is important is that the glycocalyx is heavily structured water. It essentially is highly negatively charged because all the sulfate glycosaminoglycans that are in the glycocalyx coating. That negative charge repels the lipoproteins, the ApoBs, as they're going by. Negative charges on the lipoproteins, negative charges on the red blood cell, negative repels negative. So it's kind of like a maglev train. So if you have a healthy glycocalyx, these things don't get in there to begin with. And that's what already been shown on your prior clearly scan, is that not a lot of these things had gotten in there and set up shop. Today, your testing shows that you have relatively good nitric oxide availability. Your endothelial function is very good. So if your ApoB is a little bit higher, maybe still not necessarily having a problem. And this is where the question is ApoB causative of atherosclerosis? Very likely, yes, but at what degree? And I think the missing piece is, what is the health of the glycocalyx and the endothelium first? Because we all know there's these lean mass hyperresponders out there that have LDL cholesterols of 200, 300, 400. And they will say, well, if I have calcium score 0, it doesn't matter. I would say, show me that you don't have vascular inflammation, that you don't have endothelial dysfunction. If you don't, then maybe you are that one individual where this diet is not impacting your arteries in a negative way. But I wouldn't want to wait till your calcium score is abnormal before you say, hey, I want to dial back on this nutritional strategy. It may turn out that they'll do these studies and they'll show that, in these people who are, quote, metabolically healthy, the LDL particles don't matter as much. But in my mind, I think it's because these people probably have very healthy glycocalyxes and they don't have that issue. The quick sidebar on that was that, I know in December they presented some of the preliminary data from the keto trial versus the Miami heart trial. And they were looking at baseline CT angiograms. And they basically said that, the people who were on the keto diet for, I think it was about 4 to 5 years beforehand, did not have more plaque in their arteries than the people from the Miami heart trial, who were mostly following a Mediterranean type of template. But if you actually dive into the details, the patients in the Miami heart trial, there was, I don't remember the exact percentage, 20, 30% of people were on lipid-lowering therapies, but their average LDL-C was 123. Well, that would put somebody in the 60th percentile. That doesn't mean they treated them aggressively and that they should have had lower plaque. It's just that you're comparing two groups that had super high lipoproteins and one that had high. They both had plaque because maybe they didn't fix all the reasons that their glycocalyxes were impacted. But they're not doing the prospective studies where they're going to stay on these diets and they're going to repeat a scan and see the interval, did it actually change? That'll be great data. But in the interim, you are kind of playing Russian roulette because you don't have that data. You have a lot of data that your arteries are really healthy right now. So is your ApoB actually causing a problem? It does not appear to be so. That being said, where would you like your levels? I think trying to keep less than the 20th percentile would be a good starting point. So that's generally about an ApoB of 80, maybe 70 would be a good starting point. If you want to be extremely aggressive, then that's the 5th percentile. That's 55. I don't know if ApoB of 20 is a reasonable goal for the average person. It's not. It's, if you've had multi-vessel bypass surgery and strokes and stuff, okay, maybe you got to do everything possible to throw the kitchen sink at that person. But if you're 41 years old and low risk otherwise, no, I don't think you need to use 3 pharmaceuticals to drive you all the way that low. But some would say from a kind of anecdotal standpoint, is yes, I have these family members who have naturally low ApoBs in the 40s, and they're living into their hundreds and very low calcium score test. It makes sense that you can have low ApoB and live a long life, but do we need to use lots of pharmaceuticals to drive down there? I don't know that answer yet.
Because you'd be concerned about what is the sort of side effects of that?
Partially the side effects, and is it necessarily overkill? Do we have to give you this many medications and drive ApoB to 0? How about we focus on the things that really are the problem? The oxidative stress, the inflammation, the autoimmune dysregulation. Those are the things you focus on. We're talking about high blood pressure and diabetes and lipids and smoking and obesity. They're important, but what are the arteries doing with that information? That's what you really care about. Yes, ApoB particles are going to drop cholesterol off in the arteries and plaque can build up, but it's not the only thing. And that's the thing that I just wanted to be able to share on this is like, look at your ApoBs, but the target's going to move somewhat based off of what's going on in your particular arteries at that time.
One follow-up question, in the case of somebody like your grandmother, right, you may have the information or you might have to just speculate. So you know that her ApoB levels, even without medication, were low. How do you think her endothelial health was?
Knowing that she passed away at 106 on no medications, probably pretty good. She never had hypertension as far as we know. The only time she ever saw a cardiologist is like in her 90s. She developed complete heart block. She ended up getting a pacemaker placed in, and she lived long enough that the pacemaker was end of life and was supposed to be replaced. She's like, I'm pretty old. I don't need to replace. She lived another like 8-9 years without her pacemaker working. So I think she probably had pretty decent endothelial function. That being said, she was the exception, not the rule. She did not exercise. She did not eat clean. She ate tons of processed food and soda. She lived under an airport. There's no way she slept well. She was the exception. But I can just say that, she had some lucky genes. Not everybody got them. So sometimes if you have what you don't expect, yes, blame your parents maybe a little bit, but there's so many things you can do from lifestyle that can mimic what some of these octogenarians have. So if you need to lower your vascular risk by lowering ApoB, great, we have multiple tools. If you can't tolerate statins, there's multiple tools. We'll use those instead. So I think she was lucky in ways, but I still throw it out there like my gauntlets. I'm still trying to beat her longevity record, even though I don't have the same ApoB targets genetically. I still think I can figure it out because I know what I know now.
One last question on the ApoB topic, since we're on there, is I've heard individuals like Dr. Peter Attia say, we generally want to be bringing the ApoB levels back down to where people were when they were like in their teens. Have you generally seen that people in their teens have lower ApoB levels? Obviously, in my case, I'm somebody who probably had elevated levels with familial hypercholesterolemia, but generally, is that accurate that in our teens our ApoB levels would typically be lower?
I don't know that for sure from personal experience because I usually don't see a lot of teens and have access to all their labs from that period of time. But I believe a lot of that data come out of the European consensus documents that Brian Ferentz and the group put together that really kind of linked together that yes, ApoB from the Mendelian randomization trials, the statin drug trials, some of the other observation trials is causative. It's not just a correlation. The higher ApoB, the more likely you will develop plaque in the arteries. But there are other things. You don't necessarily have familial hyperlipidemia. You don't have the one gene equals your lipids. You have kind of a more polygenic mix, and that's what that GB Insight told us, is your issue is more a hyperabsorption issue. Okay, well, ezetimibe was likely going to work better for your case. But that being said, is that yes, probably in your teens and 20s, even if you were doing a different diet than you do now, you probably had higher ApoBs than the average 20-year-old would have had. You still don't have as much plaque as a lot of 40-year-olds have right now. So what was the difference? You did something right nitric oxide wise. And so I don't think everybody needs to shoot for that goal of 20 to 40, which if that's what neonates are supposed to be. I do have some patients that come into me, they follow Dr. T and others, and they're concerned about their family history, and they ask for help. Like, I would like to lower my ApoB that low. I will support them in that mission, but I'm not pushing that mission, say, hey, everybody's got to go down this far.
And just so that people are aware, if people wanted to go down that route, what are the pharmaceutical interventions that you would be bringing in at that stage, even though that's not your primary goal with all the patients that are out there?
Sure. So go back to my bathtub analogy. It's often you're going to have to do something with the faucet. So statins or Nexletol shut off some of the cholesterol production in the liver. Maximum tolerated dose, but you get probably about 80% of the benefit at the low doses that we're using rosuvastatin. So I pretty much always will start 5 milligrams of rosuvastatin and titrate up a little bit if I need to, but I'm rarely ever going back all the way to 40 milligrams a day. Then open up the drain. That's going to be a PCSK9 inhibitor. If insurance covers it, you're usually going to be good to go. But if insurance doesn't cover it, it's $500-600 a month out of pocket for these drugs still. They just help support that LDL receptor. Open up the drain, get it out. You'll have 40% reductions in your particle count with the PCSK9 inhibitors on board. They're just extremely potent. But then often you will add the ezetimibe. Make sure that the water, once it gets into the gut, leaves. So often using triple therapy to try to drive people into those ApoB 40 or less goals.
And as you mentioned, this is really about making sure that the piping is in good health. If your piping is in great health, it's less likely that these lipids are going to be sticking in the first place. If your piping is not in great health, even if you have lower lipids that are out there, you've been on a statin before, you're doing some of these interventions, you will still end up with cardiovascular disease ultimately because the piping is not in great health.
Very much so. I mean, I said it earlier, but half the time people come in with heart attacks, they have, quote, normal cholesterol. And people always used to be like, this, how is this possible? Well, that's the thing, is that it's this endothelial dysfunction was present from their metabolic disease that we weren't really paying attention to, or they're extremely vitamin D deficient, which we weren't paying attention to 15 years ago in the cardiology world. There's something that was causing issues with their immune system. We didn't put two and two together, like rheumatoid arthritis and Hashimoto's is really just precursors that you're gonna have a lot of vascular disease unless this stuff gets dialed back. And so I think cholesterol is extremely important to this process, but just being lipid-centric, you're gonna miss too much of the story. So look at the arteries first, like you said.
When it comes to some of the areas that are around the world of biohacking, some of the fun sort of interventions that are there. We've already talked about red light therapy, how you're a big fan of it. Actually, here at your office, you have this red light panel called the Beast.
The Beast.
Made by what company? What's the name of the company?
EMR Tech makes that
EMR
one.
Tech.
Same one that makes my biohacker blue blocking glasses.
Yep. So in that same category, you mentioned the glasses, right? Through this entire interview, you've been wearing the glasses. Just give us your take on that, why you choose to do it, and generally speaking for your patients, how and why you recommend blue light blocking glasses.
So I've been doing these type of glasses since at least 2017. I was taking a very long trip from St. Louis to Bhutan and Tibet, and I was reading that jet lag was going to be pretty brutal, and so I was just trying to figure out ways to kind of mitigate that. Came upon an article that Dave Asprey had talked about, wearing these biohacking glasses on the plane. Bought a pair of the original True Dark, the wraparound Terminator ones, wore them on the plane. And I had jet lag, but it was maybe in my estimation like 1/3 as bad as it should have been. And then when I got back to the States, I'm like, I got to read up on this, like how did that even work? And then went down the rabbit hole like, oh, it's your circadian biology. It's the light signals that are hitting these receptors in your eyes that are doing that. So basically, like when you're on the plane and you're wearing the red biohacker glasses, you just told your brain it's nighttime in Asia. And so your body's just getting synced up that like when you land there, oh, it is nighttime here, and your body gets back on sync a lot easier. So basically since 2017, if I'm indoors and I don't control the light environments, I just wear these to protect my eyes because I want my brain to know what time of day it is. These don't block all blue light, and not all blue light's bad. Blue light from the sun is very, very good for you. That's what tells your body it's morning, noon, or the sun's about to set. But the light that comes off your technology or your overhead lights, that's set at the same color as basically noontime. And so if it's noon, okay, no harm, no foul. But if it's 9 o'clock at night and it's dark outside, but you turn on these lights, your body keeps getting these signals. Oh, it must be daytime. Pump out cortisol. You need to keep hunting and go find food. Like it's still daytime. So I don't want my brain to get confused. Is it day or nighttime? So I will wear these anytime I'm in front of technology or lights that I don't control. And the yellow ones, these are essentially like daytime lenses. From sun up to sundown, if I'm indoor, they're indoor sunglasses. I do not wear these outside because I want the full spectrum of light to get into my eyes. But post-sunset, the sun would set, no more blue photons hit the back of the eye, and your body should be going to bed in 3 to 4 hours. But we have all these wonderful devices and such, which is great to be able to communicate around the world, but your body's going to get confused as it's still daytime or not. So people are very sensitive. They may want to switch from the yellow lenses to the darker red lenses, because the red lenses block 100% of blue light and 100% of green light. And the body basically gets the signal, oh, it's really midnight. But I'm very, very sensitive to those glasses myself. So I will only wear them maybe half an hour before I want to go to bed, or if I'm traveling and it's got to be bed at a certain time, I'll put them on. But otherwise, I'll put them on, watching TV, and I'll fall asleep with them on. I usually tell people, like, anytime post-sunset, you could wear them, but about the hour before bed, if you throw them on and you're tracking your sleep with the rings or the watches, you'll generally see your sleep scores improving. So a lot of the biohackers keep using that just to kind of keep optimizing their sleep scores.
As a cardiologist as well, you got super into the blue light blocking glasses, and you're like very meticulous about them. What did you notice firsthand when you started using them?
Easier to fall asleep, wasn't tossing and turning. Just kind of like my sleep latency, or the time when you get into bed and you fall asleep, was falling between 10 minutes or less. It didn't feel like I had to kind of struggle. I kind of did that just because I was reading, obviously, things that we were interested in and seeing different ways of kind of modulating circadian rhythm. It's almost now my practice now when kids go to bed or once after dinner, I just put them on and just keep it on. Yeah, it's been super helpful.
When you put them on, like my nervous system is sort of trained to sort of start like relaxing a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
What time do you put the red glasses, the ones that block all the blue light? What time do you typically put those on?
Probably around like 8, 7:30 or 8.
And you fall asleep at what time?
Usually 9.
if you can last more than an hour, then that's pretty impressive.
No, but by then it's like, I gotta go. Gotta go to sleep.
Michael, anything else? You talked about the red light panels that are there. You talked about the glasses. Anything else that's in that sort of biohacking space that you're a big fan of?
So I think any of the ones that have plausibility on how they help the mitochondria are something I would focus on. Photobiomodulation, one of its major actions is making the mitochondria more efficient at making energy. This is where grounding or earthing comes in. Absorb electrons from the earth. The electrons go through the mitochondria, make more energy, lower inflammation. This is where potentially hyperbaric oxygen can help people. Not for everybody, but hyperbaric oxygen can help people, heal faster from wounds, or have traumatic brain injuries. It's helping the mitochondria make more energy efficiently. Methylene blue, possibly for some, it helps with making more energy in the mitochondria. It helps with lowering oxidative stress. So that is a possible thing that I would consider for certain people. Not all. And then, this is where kind of the cold plunging comes in as well. Cold plunging is obviously the rage right now on social media. I often joke about where do you keep a lot of your produce? You keep it in the refrigerator so it doesn't spoil. Well, to prevent spoiling in us, that cold therapy is helping lower inflammation. From a mitochondrial standpoint, it's helping the respiratory proteins in mitochondria come closer together. And when they come closer together, it's like a semiconductor. You can make energy faster through the system. That is probably the major benefit that cold thermogenesis is having, is that it just makes the mitochondria more efficient at making energy.
One of the ones that we didn't mention here is sauna. And obviously there's a ton of research that's out there on the topic of sauna. Is that something that you recommend or regularly use yourself?
Correct. And it's just that it's one that I don't necessarily put two together. It's always the mitochondrial booster that it is. But no, lots of data on sauna therapy. There's a lot of data out of Finland and Japan using it for patients with heart failure. The best way to think about the sauna is that it's also kind of a supplement. It's just different wavelengths of light that your body's absorbing. It's mostly the infrared spectrum, the heat. That heat helps structure the water that's in your cells. That glycocalyx that you have lining your 60,000 miles of blood vessels is a lot of this structured water. So that is probably one of the ways that sauna therapy is benefiting your arteries, is that it's making that glycocalyx more spongy, less things to stick to it. There's also the benefits of sweating. That sweating is going to help you get rid of the heavy metals that you're getting exposed to in your life. Maybe it's getting rid of some of these microplastics. I don't know if that's true yet. But the benefit also is that it increases your heart rate. So it's sort of like exercise without exercising. So, big fan of sauna. 3 to 4 sessions a week for people if they're really going to want to get the main benefits. And then for how long? Probably at least 20 minutes of a rolling sweat at whatever temperature it takes for you to have that sweat.
Neil, you're a huge fan of sauna. You have one in your garage. You've even got our parents on it on a regular basis. Yeah. Is that about your dosage that you're shooting for?
Yeah, I usually do 20 minutes, 3 to 4 times a week. I generally couple it right after exercise. Couple other benefits, testosterone boost. There's some other recovery functions of that because you get vasodilatation, probably nitric oxide increase, which can be helpful. But I definitely tell people, if you get the exercise and the cardio dialed in, this can be a supplement. This can be an additional boost to your regimen.
Fantastic. Michael, you've covered a lot here in today's episode. We've talked about, what are some of the things that increase people's risk of cardiovascular disease? We talked about some of the top blood tests that everybody should be paying attention to. We talked about some of the advanced screening options that you guys have here, and some of the ones that you also recommend to people that you don't do here but are a big part of your practice, like the Clearly test. We talked about supplementation and what are some of the supplements that could be supportive towards our endothelial health and potentially even removing soft plaque. We also talked about dietary interventions, some of the basics that everybody can be paying attention to, but how also personalization of the diet is most pivotal when it comes to truly reducing our risk of heart disease. Any diet could be done well or any diet could be done unwell when it comes to the personalization of increasing or reducing our risk of cardiovascular disease. And we also talked about pharmaceutical interventions and what some of the top ones are for individuals. Anything that we didn't get a chance to touch on that you want to share with our audience?
No, first off, I just want to thank you again for the opportunity of coming out to see us here at Apollo Cardiology and going through the gauntlet of the testing to see how healthy your arteries are, because we all have this goal of longevity, but it's really more about health span. It's how well are those years going to be. And vascular disease is still the number one thing that takes people out sooner than they want. And it's maybe not even the thing that's going to kill them initially, but it may decrease their quality of life. But if you get a handle of this thing early, you can live your life a very long time without these events. Even if you have bad genetics, even if you have high cholesterol, there's a lot of things you can do to take your vascular health back into your own hands. Your doctor's always there as kind of the Sherpa to guide you, but start with the things that you have in your own control. It's how you fuel the body, how you move the body, how you deal with your stress, how you sleep. Those are all things your doctors aren't going to do for you. You have to figure out how to do that every single day. Then, working with somebody who can help you, you can get the right testing to look at what's floating through your blood, the biochemical, and then you can do the biophysical testing, like what is the state of the arteries? Are their arteries stiff? Is there soft plaque building up? Is there hard plaque? You can figure out where you fall on those spectrums, and then you can decide, okay, I need to be way more aggressive, or what I'm doing is working for me. Your vascular health is in your hands. If you understand the basics, it's really not that hard to reverse this stuff. You just have to first go looking for it and know what you're dealing with.
Well, Michael, on behalf of myself, my brother-in-law, Dr. Neel Patel, we want to thank you and your team for hosting us here, taking us through the gauntlet of the test, getting us a chance to see sort of behind the scenes of how you organize your practice, why you use the tests that you do, and mostly for just being an incredible person who has the heart of a teacher, who really wants the audience to learn. There's not that many resources when it comes to the most advanced interventions and approaches when it comes to cardiovascular disease and functional and integrative and precision medicine. And your voice being out there as being one of the main ones has been a huge benefit to our audience. So thank you on behalf of myself, Neel, Kumar, but also thank you on behalf of our audience as well.
You're very welcome. Thank you, guys.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
The evidence is clear to me that a high carbohydrate, highly processed, high sugar diet is what leads to metabolic disorders and most, if not all, chronic diseases.